Evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar. Councilmember Dubala. Here. Councilmember Costick. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith. Here. Councilmember Searcy.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to our meeting tonight. Looking at our agenda this evening, we have no changes for tonight. Let me get the piece of paper out. Looking at our meetings to come in the future. Next Wednesday on January 23rd, we have our regular meeting. However, we will be starting at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 7:30. We will actually be holding our Green Team meeting. That is the meeting between the City Council and the Committee on the Environment. We were supposed to have that this past Monday night, but had to postpone it because of the weather. So next Wednesday, January 23rd, here at 6 p.m., from 6 p.m. to 7:30, we will be holding the Green Team meeting. Following that, at 7:30, we'll have our regular City Council meeting. We'll start that night with a presentation from the Crossroads Community Food Network. Our work sessions will include an update and review of council priorities, a discussion of amendments to the Tacoma Park Code purchasing chapters 7.04, 7.08, and 7.12, and a review of council procedures. Then on Thursday, January 24th, we will have one of our two council retreat meetings that will be in the hydrangea room, and and we'll have another one on Tuesday, January 29th. Both of those are open to the public. However, we do not have public comments during those meetings. And then our final meeting in January will be on Wednesday, January 30th. We will be here starting at 7:30. Our voting session that evening will be a resolution adopting the 2018 Emergency Operations Plan. Should that be 2018 Emergency Plan? We're adopting last year's emergency plan this year?
We'll check and see.
Okay.
But I think because it's gone through the other system, I'm not sure. It's kind of up to the county how they want to define it.
Okay.
It's really not just ours.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. I like adopting things from the year prior. And then we, I know, we did great. We tentatively, depending on how our conversation goes this evening, we have a resolution adopting a definition of commercial property, and then tentatively a resolution adopting council procedures. Our work session that evening will be a quarterly financial report, and then we'll be off into February. So this evening, we are kicking off our meeting tonight with a presentation. It is a report from the last Plastic Straw Tacoma Park group, and they have sent us a PowerPoint. So I'm just going to ask you, whoever's going to present tonight can come to the podium, and I will turn on the microphone, and it is all yours.
Thank you, Mayor Stewart and the City Council for putting us on our agenda. We have been working to ban plastic straws in Tacoma Park for almost a year. We wanted to talk as many restaurants as possible about making the switch. Then some restaurants started to make the change. Since we're very close to the Chesapeake, small actions have a big impact. So we are proposing that Tacoma Park ban plastic straws and stirrers. Now I'd like to turn it over to slides by Will.
Ban single-use plastic straws in Tacoma Park. If we ban straws in Tacoma Park, will it help slow global warming?
A little bit.
So why bother?
Behavior starts small, and small actions add up. Also, plastic straws harm people and the environment.
Many plastic straws contain BPA or other known carcinogens. The off-gassing associated with their production results in pollution and greenhouse gases, and plastic straws contribute to the floating islands of trash and harm wildlife in our oceans and local waterways like Sago Creek. Are cities and companies signing on to a ban of single-use straws and other plastics?
Yes.
Which cities and regions?
DC, Miami Beach, Fort Myers, Delray Bay Beach, California, Seattle, Vancouver, and the whole EU.
Which companies?
Starbucks Worldwide, McDonald's UK, Aramark, American Airlines, Alaska Airlines, Hyatt, Hilton, SeaWorld, Royal Caribbean, Coca-Cola in Australia, and Disney.
We visited Langley Crossroads. Levi, Alejandro, and Sammy went to the restaurant managers at Langley Crossroads. Most respectively promised to pass info along to the owners.
Republic is on board.
Some restaurants don't offer straws.
Some talked with their managers.
Many restaurants like Popeyes and Busboys and Poets shared our request. Some switched early.
MCPS is a work in progress.
Although there's a ban in place, club-sponsored events like back-to-school night sometimes include straws. A ban on education will help shift perspectives and habits.
Mark's, after a night of campaigning, we were served a plastic straw at Mark's.
Now paper straws are available by request. Mark said we'd find a good source and use up our existing supply of straws, but then it was easy. We throw out fewer straws. Everybody likes it.
That's it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sammy and Will. Great job. I'm Lori Hill, and I live in Ward 2. I participate in the city's Adopt a Spot program, and I regularly pick up trash along a section of Carroll Avenue and throughout my neighborhood and along Sligo Creek Trail. My non-scientific estimate is that 90% of what I pick up is plastic. Plastic packaging from what I call crap snacks, plastic cups and lids from sodas, plastic water and soda bottles, plastic cutlery, and of course plastic straws. So this is physical evidence of our fast-paced, on-the-go society where we use things just once and then toss them away. It's not just a detriment to our health and well-being, but also the health of our planet. The false economy of single-use, disposable plastic is now very clear. The cheap price of plastic products doesn't capture the mounting environmental cost of planetary plastic pollution, as Sammy and Will explained. It's time for a paradigm shift to reusables. Reusable cups, cutlery, and straws. But we haven't quite reached the tipping point where the world fully embraces reusables. So until we can retrain the world and our Takoma Park community, we need to use disposables that have a low impact on the planet. And when it comes to straws, that option is paper straws. A little less than a year ago, I approached the Council's Committee on the Environment about phasing out plastic straws in Takoma Park. It was at that time that the committee and I were made aware of Sammy and Will's efforts and decided to join forces and form the Last Plastic Straw at Takoma Park. Our mission is to build awareness among restaurants and patrons about the environmental impact of plastic straws and to have plastic straws and stirrers phased out of all food outlets and stores in Takoma Park. This effort is going to require a behavior change on the part of restaurants, their employees, and patrons. Restaurants can be the first to switch from plastic to paper straws. And instead of automatically placing a straw in every drink, employees need to begin providing straws only upon request. This simple action could actually save restaurants money. Patrons, most of whom don't use straws in their drinks at home, can begin to think about why they expect straws when they eat out and forgo straws unless they really need them, which we recognize is the case for some people. Patrons can also bring their own straw. We realize that this is a paradigm shift, and one of the goals of the Last Plastic Straw at Takoma Park is to make this paradigm shift easier for everyone. We are here to help, and this is how we plan to do it. First of all, we've created a website. It's thelastplasticstraw.tacomapark.org, and it contains facts, figures, helpful articles, and frequently asked questions about the harmful impact of plastics on our environment here in Tacoma Park and around the world. We have a Get Started section where restaurants and citizens can take action. Citizens may sign our petition to phase out plastic straws and stirrers in Tacoma Park. They can sign up for our mailing list for tips on how to avoid plastic straws and to get updates about restaurants that have made the switch to paper. They may also encourage their favorite restaurants to make the switch to paper straws. Restaurants that still use plastic straws may sign up for our starter kit, which includes a starter supply of plastic straws. Each of you have a sample of one of those straws that we will be handing out. Posters in English and Spanish to announce their switch to paper. Downloadable flyers in English and Spanish to place on tables or in menus which announce their switch and provides facts and about plastic straws. And we'll provide a training sheet in English and Spanish. We'll also provide in-person staff coaching sessions if a restaurant requests it. So you each have a sample of our starter straws, our posters in Spanish and English, our downloadable flyers, and our staff training sheet. Finally, if restaurants have no idea of where to go to purchase paper straws, we've done the research for them. We've included on our website a downloadable straw and stirrer pricing guide, which includes the cost of a variety of paper straw options, companies that are based in the United States and elsewhere. You have this in your handouts too. So at this time, I want to point out to you that not all paper straws are created equally, and that paper straws of today are nothing like the paper straws I used as a kid in the 70s. The sample straws we are providing to Tacoma Park restaurants are from World Centric, which is a US-based company. These are readily available from Baltimore-based Leonard Paper Company, which as of November had in their warehouse 150 cases at 6,000 straws to a case. I personally used one of the straws that you have, and I used it for 4 days straight. I know that sounds a little grotesque, but trust me, I wanted to see how long it would last, and so I was drinking a beverage from this straw for 4 straight days. It did not collapse, and I'm pretty confident it could have gone for a good 30 days. We've purchased 12,000 World-Centric paper straws, 6,000 wrapped like you have, and 6,000 unwrapped. The straws cost $148 a case of 6,000, which is 2.46 cents per straw, and come in individually wrapped packages of 100 each. A quick search on Amazon to check the cost of plastic straws gave a price of about 1.8 cents per straw, or 0.6 of a cent difference per straw. So 0.6 of a cent more per straw is the paper straws you have. On a related note, the Tacoma Langley Crossroads Business Association has applied for a grant from the state that can be used to purchase straws for their members. They will know in 2 months if their grant is being awarded. If so, they will receive money in April 2019. Now, after extensive research on how other cities handled their plastic straw bans, we drafted a proposed ordinance, the latest version which you have in your handouts, and we presented it to City Council members Cindy Dybala, Peter Kovar, and Jarrett Smith this past fall. Upon reviewing it, we were told there were 2 main concerns: the impact on people with disabilities and the potential increased cost to small businesses. We know that some people require a straw to drink beverages, either because of a disability or for some other reason. Our extensive research has found that many people in the disability community are concerned that paper straws are not an adequate alternative to plastic straws. However, we haven't been able to confirm if they are basing those concerns on the paper straws of today or paper straws of the past. We provided a supply of paper straws to a constituent of Disability Rights Maryland who normally requests plastic straws due to his disability. And after trying out the straws, he told us, quote, "I used the straws. They were very helpful. They lasted quite a long time, and I actually let it sit for a while in my beverage and it did not dissolve," unquote. When asked if he felt these straws would be acceptable to people who needed straws to drink, he replied, quote, "I think they would be acceptable to most people using them," unquote. Now, we realize this is only one person, but it gives us hope that maybe one day we can phase out plastic straws completely because the new model paper straws will be acceptable to those who must drink from straws. And we are continuing to reach out to people with disabilities who need straws to drink and will report any new findings to the council in future meetings. Nonetheless, while we would love to phase out plastic straws completely right now, our draft ordinance includes the following exception. And it states, the requirement that only paper drinking straws be provided will not apply when customers with self-identified medical or physical conditions for whom paper straws are unsuitable request disposable, flexible plastic drinking straws. Retail establishments will maintain a small stock of plastic straws for such use. Now, because we're permitting restaurants to retain a small stock of plastic straws for those who require a plastic straw, we don't consider this ordinance to essentially be a ban on plastic straws, but rather an effort to dramatically reduce their use. So this brings me to another council concern related to people with disabilities. Because restaurants could be fined for providing plastic straws when they are not needed, there is a concern that an unfair burden would be placed on a person who needs a plastic straw and that they might be asked intrusive questions about the details of why they need a plastic straw. And this is definitely and obviously not what we intended. As a result, we reached out to Disability Rights Maryland for their advice. Disability Rights Maryland is the state's designated protection and advocacy agency and is a member of the National Disability Rights Network. They indicated that if a patron asks for a plastic straw, that person should receive it, no questions asked. Specifically, they advised us, quote, there should be no burden placed on the person who needs a plastic straw to justify the need for it. If a person with a disability requests a plastic straw, that should be the end of it. No questions needed from the waitstaff and no fine imposed on the restaurant. The training should focus not on training waitstaff to make judgments about who needs a straw and who doesn't, but on educating the public as to why the plastic straw ban is being implemented. This may involve a more gradual change than what you're envisioning, but it's important that waitstaff not have to make judgment calls here, unquote. Our staff training sheet, which you have a copy of, specifically states, quote, some patrons may request a plastic straw due to a health condition that makes it difficult for them to drink from a paper straw. If a customer requests a plastic straw, provide it without asking any questions. Patrons should never be asked to prove they need a plastic straw. The second concern about our draft ordinance raised by members of City Council was potential increased costs to small businesses. Paper straws tend to cost about 1 cent more per straw than plastic straws, and in my earlier example, it was actually less than 1 cent per straw. However, the overall cost increase or decrease will depend on the types of plastic straws restaurants currently use, the type of paper straws they switch to, and the extent to which customers ask for them. Our materials encourage restaurants to only provide paper straws only on request. That strategy alone can save money and reduce plastic waste. We realize, however, that this strategy will be easier for sit-down restaurants than to-go style restaurants. Specifically, while patrons of sit-down restaurants can easily drink a beverage without a straw since they'll just be sitting at a table while consuming their beverage, patrons of to-go style restaurants will be more inclined to take a straw with their beverage since it will most likely be consumed on the go from a cup with a plastic lid. If patrons of to-go style restaurants use paper straws at the rate they have been using plastic straws, costs for those restaurants could indeed increase. But there are other options. Instead of placing a box of straws out in a public area for patrons to grab their own, to-go style restaurants can switch to a policy of keeping straws behind the counter and only providing them upon request. To-go style restaurants can encourage patrons to bring their own reusable container and perhaps even offer a beverage discount for those who do so. And on a personal note, on the rare occasions that I drink a soda, I bring my own reusable bottle, and I not only avoid the straw, but I avoid the cup and I avoid the lid. And it is a win-win. I save money because the restaurant or food outlet usually charges me for the cost of a refill, and the restaurant doesn't use up a cup, a straw, or a lid, and it also reduces the amount of waste created. Related to the bring your own container concept, restaurants could possibly even make money by selling branded to-go cups that patrons can use over and over again and fill up their beverage at a discounted price. Now, we have identified approximately 48 restaurants and food outlets within the borders of Tacoma Park. Some of them don't use straws at all, but for those who do, whether paper or plastic, we are surveying them. Specifically, we recently began a systematic outreach to include every Tacoma Park restaurant and food outlet. This is in addition to the outreach that Sammy and Will and the other students already conducted to raise awareness about the environmental impact of plastic straws. During this new wave of in-person visits, we are providing an information sheet in English and Spanish to give restaurants an overview of the last plastic straw at Tacoma Park and to let them know that we are here to help them. A hard copy of our survey along with a link to the online version. Both are in English and Spanish, and there is a version for restaurants who use paper straws and a version for restaurants who use plastic straws, and you have copies of those in your handouts. Both the information sheet, and you also have a copy of the information sheet in your handouts. Now, we're asking restaurants who have already made the switch to paper straws to share with us their numbers. We're asking how much did their plastic straws cost and how much did they use a month? And then when they switched to paper straws, how much did their paper straws cost a month and how much of those do they use a month? We're also asking them for the names of the brands they currently use, because if they've used some in the past that are bad, we want to pass that on to the other restaurants. And if they're satisfied with some, we want to let people know what are the good brands. Finally, we've asked them if they would be willing to share their experiences at a future city council meeting. We're also asking restaurants that currently still use plastic straws for costs and quantities used per month. We're asking if they have any concerns about switching to paper straws. And finally, we've also asked them to indicate if they would like to voice their concerns at a future city council meeting. By collecting information from restaurants that currently use paper straws and restaurants that currently use plastic straws, we hope to adequately address any concerns about increased expenses due to a phase out of plastic straws and offer sustainable and affordable solutions. We realize that some restaurants may be ready to make the switch to paper now, regardless of whether or not an ordinance is passed. In contrast, some restaurants may need assistance with the transition if the ordinance passes. In either case, upon request, we will provide restaurants with the starter kit I explained earlier. Now, we may be getting ahead of ourselves, but we'd be remiss if we didn't address enforcement. We're proud of Tacoma Park's effort. We are proud of Tacoma Park's efforts to ban polystyrene and most plastic bags and to have restrictions on cosmetic pesticides. However, the city's website is not very clear on how someone can report a business or household that is not in compliance with these initiatives. We hope that if the proposed ordinance to phase out plastic straws is eventually passed, the city will make it very clear how to report businesses that are not compliant with our efforts to have a safe, clean, and healthy Tacoma Park. Hold on, let me say that again. We hope that if the proposed ordinance to phase out plastic straws is eventually passed, the city will make it very clear how to report businesses that are not compliant, or our efforts to have a safe, clean, and healthy Tacoma Park will be wasted. Therefore, we urge you to put information about how to report non-compliance of any of our initiatives front and center wherever it is shared. We understand that the council will need to have at least one or more work sessions before your reading and vote on the ordinance. In the meantime, we would like to formally ask the council to take up this issue, and we will continue to offer our support and assistance in any way the council would find helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation this evening and an update on your efforts. Just I'm going to ask my colleagues quickly if they had any questions, just looking at the hour and the other things on our agenda this evening. Councilwoman DeBala?
I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here and all the work that you have all done over the past nearly a year. The Committee on the Environment, the adults, the middle schoolers. This is a very positive approach to wanting a change in city legislation. And since you have already provided us with a draft ordinance, and I have read it, I can say that it's modeled on ordinances that the city already has for for plastic bags and polystyrene. So it's not that much of a stretch in that respect. And thank you for addressing disability issues. I have just this week been in touch with the Village of Tacoma Park and Posner about reaching out to people who live in the community. And for your information on the small business impacts, thank you. So I would like to propose that, I would like to ask that we schedule a work session on this and for the city manager to get this to whichever staff need to look at it besides the attorney, so we can consider moving forward. Thank you.
Councilmember Searcy?
Thank you so much for the presentation and the straw. I'm using it, and it doesn't taste like cardboard, so I can get down with this.
Yeah.
One question that I do have is about the lids. So if the ultimate goal is to try to get folks to the point where they self-select into requesting one of the paper straws, are you guys collecting any data on whether or not the businesses would need to change the types of lids that they currently use to allow for patrons to drink their beverage without a straw at all?
From the research that we've seen, I haven't seen too much we haven't seen anything that says specifically that those paper straws do not work in lids. They're pretty sturdy.
No. I mean, so like Starbucks, for example, when they transitioned, the actual type of lid that they have changed. And so because of the new type of lid, you're not inclined to ask for a straw. If you still have the same kind of soda lid where you have the little hole and then you need a straw to actually, it's not like you could flip an edge and drink from the straw. So drink directly from the cup. So the question is, were you guys asking any questions about whether or not any lid changes would be needed in order to accommodate, to ultimately get people to the point where they're not asking for a straw at all, if that makes sense?
We didn't get into that with any businesses. Now, I do know that, some of the big chains, one of the things I've so far visited with about 17 restaurants, and some of the big chains, I've asked them, do you know of anything coming down the pike? And most of them were like, we haven't really heard anything, other than, of course, Starbucks. But I don't think anybody's planning on changing lids, if that's what you're asking. And none of them were asking us, are we going to have to change our lids? We're just like trying to keep it simple. Let's just focus on straws. I would love to see plastic lids go away too. But we're trying to start smart. We would, of course, everybody I think on our committee would love to just see plastic banned in Tacoma Park. But we thought, let's just start, keep it simple, and go from there.
Thank you.
Councilmember Smith?
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation. First, let me say that I was on the council when we banned polystyrene and Safe Grow when we passed that. Polystyrene, we did talk about disabilities and how we can deal with that with the hospital. We got through it, so I don't see that as a big problem.
Yeah.
Let me say, I would like you guys to just ban it. Ban the use of plastic straws. Well, you could.
Yeah.
Asking us to ban.
Yeah. No, well, I'll let you finish. I'm sorry.
Because I think this is like one of the biggest issues, for the country and for the world. I mean, there was a 60 Minutes piece that talked about how plastic is now in the food supply.
Yeah.
So we have to do everything possible to push back on it.
Yeah.
Another thing is, I sponsored the plastic bag ban. I know it's not perfect, but you know, it's something that maybe we can redress as a council and look at ways
I would love to see that.
to tighten it up. And I was the one who came up with the anti-litter initiative. So, you know, I appreciate the work that you guys are doing, but I would just hope it's as strict as possible, because this is very, very important.
When I first met these guys, they were like, ban it. And I'm with them. And all the research that the committee saw, when it came to people with disabilities, the disability community is basically up in arms, and they're like, stop picking on us, you're not thinking about us. We have people that need to use plastic straws. And I do think some of that is justified, but I also do think that some of them when it comes to paper straws, they are truly thinking of paper straws from the past and the type that collapse. And they are unaware of the new model paper straws. And so it was really great to get that feedback from that one person who said, this lasted for me, I could use it. But I do know there are challenges of when, you know, if people, sometimes a person with a disability might need to like bite down on the straw and they could hurt themselves, and sometimes the paper can be weird in their mouth, and so plastic apparently tends to work better. So that was our only reason for allowing that provision, but again, it's only upon request. But yeah, I don't like the idea of them being in restaurants at all, because they're tempted, and the training that we have is we specifically say, put your big supply of plastic straws in the back. You know, don't put them right next to the paper straws, because staff will be tempted to use them. I know Annapolis Green experienced that when they were trying to switch to paper.
I also think, looking at your draft that you sent us, there is a clause, there is a section in here about reviewing the ordinance every after 3 years. So that might, if it was put in regarding having the straws available for people with disabilities after 3 years, seeing how it worked, then you couldn't do it. The other question I had actually was, in DC, their flyers talk about making sure that plastic straws are available to make sure they're compliant with federal disabilities rights laws. And so it seems that we may not actually have a choice if we need to be compliant with, and this might be a question for our city attorney when they review it, but we can just have that as a question. I just noticed that the DC that just went into the ban that just went in effect there on January 1st actually says in order to be compliant with federal disabilities laws, they're making sure that places have the straws available. So I think that would be just something when when we have questions for the city attorney in a work session can review.
And then I just finally like to say that I support us moving forward with a work session.
Great. Councilwoman Kostick?
I want to reiterate my thanks to all of you for this presentation and your very thorough level of work. It's clear that you've thought this through completely and really had a lot of answers and a lot of research, so I really appreciate that. I was wondering how much you have done or looked at in terms of what your recommendations here and how those, what those are and how they correspond to the DC law. And you know, since we do border DC and some of the businesses will you know, interact and people are going between the two businesses, I'm just curious if there are things that are similar or different between the two, and if there could be in the future some outreach to the DC businesses to see how their transition has been.
I actually reached out and had a phone conversation with one of the DC groups that was working on their ban, and the one thing they pointed out to me, well, first of all, their ban went into effect January 1. They're issuing warnings now, and then in 6 months, that's when people will be fined. So kind of similar to how we do it with our, you know, gradual phase out, and then, you know, 6 months it takes effect. The other thing, if I'm correct, and committee members can correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe they allow compostable straws, and for purposes, what we mean by compostable is like the plastic compostable, correct? Yes? Okay, so, you know, the plant-based compostable. And we were definitely against that because as we have learned that unless those are going to be disposed of in a commercial composter, they are going to have the same problem as a plastic straw. So we do not think that that is a viable option. So that's why, now it could be a viable option for restaurants to use as their plastic alternative, but that's it. That's all. That's the only way we see using that.
Interesting. Thank you. And as the businesses go through that transition and over the next month or two, it would be interesting to get their feedback.
Yeah, I would say the other thing that we're doing differently is, number one, we're lucky because we're pretty aware. Our borders are easy. We know where the restaurants are, and we can have that one-on-one relationship with them. And, you know, it's my goal to like have personal relationships with these restaurant owners and say, hey, how can we help you? And for them, they've got a band of people going around from restaurant to restaurant doing outreach, but those are volunteers, and they're kind of doing it here and there and just kind of catching people when they can. But I kind of feel like DC is not doing like a hands-on approach. And I kind of feel like their restaurants might be, where do we go? What do we do? What are the resources?
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks to the students also. It was really great to hear something so well thought out. I would like to see us go forward with it. We have our priority setting process that takes place in January, so I think it should be done in that context, but I would support going forward with it that way. I just had a couple of questions or comments as well. I do think the disability thing is important, and we just have to do that. And later on, if it changes, that's fine. But I do know of people personally who need to use a straw, and I think it's something that we just have to make sure meets the relevant standards. I think the takeout places will probably be a tougher one because I think it's relatively easy. Someone's sitting there, and you know you can even explain to them while they're waiting, hey, by the way, we don't bring out straws, and they're okay, fine. But when you're doing the takeout thing, I think it's more complicated. And so I'm not precisely familiar with the Starbucks approach these days, but I don't know whether you think what could be done to encourage takeout places to actually be able to do this. I mean, what's your sense on that? It's
going to be challenging if they're a big chain. You know, for example, I talked to Bobby from Wingstop. He was one of the first people from Tacoma Langley Business Association to get back to us when they were alerted of this possibility, and he was really upset. And he said, I'm like 95% to go, and this is going to cost me more money, and I'm not happy about it. And you know, I tried to explain to him that it shouldn't cost a lot more money, and it just got to the point where he just didn't want to talk to me anymore. It was on email, this conversation. It is my goal to become best friends with Bobby, okay? I really want to get him and talk to him about this idea of, you know, sell a branded cup, you know, because Wingstop is all across the country and in California. And I'm confident that that is something that they could do and look into. So, you know, I'm determined to, you know, get these big corporations to, you know, look into this possibility of having branded cups that they can sell and encourage. We have to encourage a reusable.
But some of them are already doing it in these certain larger cities, right?
Yeah.
So there must be chains there in the way that there aren't necessarily as many here. So there has to be a model for that. And then I was just, you mentioned something about the non-compliance, and you repeated the sentence a few times. But before that, you said something about compliance with the restaurants or the families, and I wondered what you meant.
Oh, by that one, I was talking about all of our initiatives. Okay, so families, homes with the cosmetic lawn care.
Oh, okay.
You know,
That's okay.
So that's, you know, because in my neighborhood are two of the women that were very involved with that effort, and so it's sort of like they know where to go.
Okay, oh, that's fine. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say is I was in one of the restaurants today, and they're phasing out their straws already. But the thing I noticed, and this relates to the lids that was mentioned earlier, there's so many other things in there. And the person who was waiting on me even pointed it out. And the little cups that have the cream that you pour into your sugar. And so there's a lot more steps that could be taken. So I guess I would just encourage people, if we move forward on this, not to think that this will be it. You know, I mean, we did the bags earlier, and then if we do this, and then there are probably a lot of other steps that could be taken too. So thank you again.
Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. As you might have guessed, first of all, thank you for the presentation, all the work that you all have put into this. But you might have guessed that I'm the oldest member of this council. And I often like to give a little historical perspective, and I would just encourage you all to see where things were when I got out of school and do a Google search on the graduate plastics.
Yes.
Everybody's
and you'll see
what
how
things change as we learn more.
Yeah.
That's all. Thank you.
All right. Great. I just have one other question. How many businesses have the posters now?
Well, only one right now,
Okay.
because we just recently started outreach like Saturday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and it's only, and technically we're giving them to those who've made the switch to
Right.
paper.
Yeah.
And Roscoe's has one, but some of the others, they're like, we've made the switch, we've been doing it for a while, we don't need your poster, and that's fine. So, yeah.
All right, I just wanted to ask. All right, well, thank you. As Councilmember Kovar says, and I announced before, in the next couple of weeks, we have our priority sessions. As you probably heard, our agenda is pre-packed for the rest of January. But after we do our priority setting, we'll hopefully get a work session together. And we look forward to continuing to hear updates on the work that you're doing. In the meantime, I think the city attorney has seen this version of the ordinance, and we will make sure relevant staff review it as well and provide their feedback. Do we have an electronic copy of this version? If we could get an if we could get an electronic copy of this version of the ordinance,
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
the latest version,
Sure.
we can make sure that the relevant city staff have an opportunity to look it over and provide their feedback as well.
Sure.
So, and yeah, we'll get this on the calendar.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening. All right, that was our presentation for tonight. Next, we'll move on to, we have no voting items this evening, so we will move on to general public comments. Anyone with public comments, please come to the podium.
Good evening. My name is Larry Silverman. I live on Birch Avenue, and I own S&A Beads now in Washington, D.C. I wanted to talk just really quickly about the distribution of the taxation of commercial property. I would like to make 3 points about it. First, in any taxation scheme, it's good to spread the burden as well as you can. Under the inventory tax system, the whole burden was on the people on the first floor with stores, and the people on the upper floors did not bear that. Now it's spread more evenly. Number two, I think in any taxation, particularly commercial taxation plan, I think you need to sell the benefits. I really do think that there needs to be some conversations, particularly with the larger enterprises in the city, about the benefits they get from the city, what it costs the city to service them. And to begin to get an understanding in your own minds, but also to help the taxpayers understand what they're getting from the city and what's good about it. I think that it's commercial taxation is most palatable when the business people have a feeling that they're getting something for their money. So I think that's a really important point. Particularly with the larger ones, because some businesses may be costing the city a lot more than other businesses. It'd be good to know that in distributing the tax burden. And I feel like Rick Perry. There's a third point. Oh yes, businesses compete. And you want to know what your competitors are doing. And I think when you think about the commercial tax rate, you may take a look at our competing municipalities and counties and states to see what kind of commercial tax they're imposing, particularly the district, because that's very important. It helps determine whether people want to come to your city or go to the other city if they get a better break. I don't know this, but my sense is that the commercial tax rates in the city and also in the county are fairly rigorous. But I don't know that. But I think that's an investigation you should conduct. I don't think it's going to be hard. Probably there is a city official in D.C. who knows all that, and I think you should then act accordingly. So demonstrate the benefits, distribute the burden, and look at the competition. That's my advice on the commercial taxation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments this evening? Okay, seeing none, then we will move to council comments. Any council comments this evening? Councilmember Smith.
I just want to remind my colleagues that tomorrow is the Montgomery County Chapter Dinner in Chevy Chase. Starts at 6:15. So I hope you can make it. Thank you.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. Monday evening, following the snowstorm, I worked with Adventist Community Services and actually greeted people as they came in the door, because Adventist Community Services was providing food to furloughed federal government workers and contractors. And I just wanted to comment a second on the experience, because you know, we hear about this horrible situation. We think we know what people are thinking and doing. We hear suggestions that maybe people should treat it like a vacation. And I can assure you that the people who came to pick up food didn't impart any feelings of being on vacation. They were very concerned about their situation. They were very happy to receive some food to help them get through. And I think one of the things that I learned, and I mean it's obvious when you think about it, is that they're not all department directors coming through there. We have a lot of people who are clerks or cafeteria workers and other people who are on the lower end of the pay scale in the federal government. And they're having difficulty going, you know, their normal life is going from paycheck to paycheck, and now they've missed paycheck and having difficulty feeding their families and taking care of business. I heard stories about, you know, their inability to pay their rent or their house payments, and you know, people standing at the desk crying over their situation, and it's appalling. I just wanted to share with the rest of the community that you know, people are in need of assistance. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Siemens. Councilmember Kostick.
Thank you. Just trying to collect my random notes here. I have a lot of comments, and they're not all related to each other. First of all, I wanted to thank Public Works and the city manager and all of the staff members who worked very hard in the snowstorm for the snow clearing, and I think did a great job of getting information out. In particular, I heard a lot of great comments from residents thanking the city for the information that was provided. I also want to provide an update on a couple of things. We heard just yesterday from DC Councilmember Brandon Todd, who said he will help us try to get some information from Washington Gas that we've been trying to get regarding their work on Eastern Avenue. And hopefully we'll be able to get that information. And then Director of Public Works has been working on creating a calendar of sorts, a schedule to show some of the ongoing work that will happen on Eastern Avenue, starting with the PEPCO work that's been going on, Washington Gas work, WSSC work, and then DDOT also doing work to renovate the street. So there's a lot going on there, and hopefully this next step in getting the information from Washington Gas will give us a chance to move that along, so we'll be able to get that finalized and out to residents. I also want to thank, I always get this acronym wrong, MNCPPC, for clearing the snow in front of the gazebo, which was an issue we've had in the past, and we reached out to them and they went ahead and cleared it, and that was very helpful, and I want to thank them for doing that. I do have a question I'm not sure if staff know anything about this or if this was utility work or something else. I was on New Hampshire Avenue today around 3 o'clock, and all 3 of the lanes going northbound between like a little past, a little north of Belford Place were blocked off. And there was a utility vehicle with a bucket up working on the wires, and there was no signage, there was no traffic management, nothing. I imagine it was emergency work, but I don't know what it was, and I was just curious if anyone knew about it and if we could work with the utilities again to suggest that they try to think these things through a little bit.
I wasn't aware of it. I don't know if somebody else knew about it, but
Okay.
I'm assuming it was emergency, and yes, they should be letting us know, and they should have the right kind of flaggers and signs up.
We had a TPB, Transportation Planning Board meeting today, and discussed several important things. Probably the most important was a discussion of target setting, which is a requirement from the federal government for traffic fatalities and serious injuries, which is a pretty depressing subject to discuss and set targets for. But one of the things that we as a board discussed was trying to go beyond some of the work that's been done in the past to really focus on ways that we can reduce these numbers, which seem to, in the past year or two, be going in the wrong direction. And a lot of the jurisdictions in this area have initiatives to reduce those numbers, but there's more that we can do, I think, as local jurisdictions and also collaboratively on the Transportation Planning Board and throughout the region. So that's something I hope we'll be able to work on more moving into the future. And then finally, I wanted to provide an update on the bill in the state legislature regarding 410. As you might recall, we discussed this previously with our delegation. There's a bill being proposed that would prevent the expansion of 410 for vehicle traffic. And there was a meeting yesterday of the Montgomery County delegation where this was presented. We talked with our state lobbyist today, and she said there was not a lot of discussion at the meeting about it, but there was a presentation on it. And we, as a council, are going to do some work to reach out to the other delegates and members of the delegation to advocate and express the importance of this bill and why this is something that we need. And I also want to encourage residents as much as possible to reach out, not just to our delegates who already know the importance of this, but to delegates throughout the Montgomery County, so that they get a sense of why we're putting this out and why it's so important. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Kolar.
Thank you. And I do want to also mention the snow plowing and cleaning up work by our staff, which I think on the whole was excellent. I think there's still an ongoing challenge for a lot of people because we're all used to always just doing all the things we always do, and sometimes we have to stop and say, hey, it snowed for 24 hours, maybe we can't do those things. On the other hand, I do think it's also worth looking at this question of the sidewalks that get hit after people have cleared them, and I don't know if we have any sort of data just on if there were any of those that the Public Works Bureau had to go back out and do. We'd just be interested to know if there were some instances of that, but how many, if we have the record and that kind of thing. It would be good to try to know. And the other thing is, and this follows up on what Councilmember Kostick said, there are a few spots separate from when residents need to do the sidewalks, but there are areas that just tend not to get done. That was one which I appreciate Councilmember Kostick mentioning and helping to get taken care of. But for example, there's also, it's technically DC, I think, but it's kind of a no man's land when you get over to the Tacoma Metro stop, but it's only people from Tacoma Park who are kind of walking there, and it can be really bad. And so I don't know whether it would be possible to just figure out where these areas are that tend not to get done and try to come up with a way of addressing them, because it is slippery at times and dangerous. So I put that out there. A few other things. I appreciate what Councilmember Siemens said about the federal workers. I was fortunate in a way when I worked in the federal government, because while I always had to show up, even if I wasn't getting paid, you know, I had a spouse in the private sector, and so I was okay. And, you know, I was well compensated also, I think I should say. But I don't know whether, can the emergency funds that we have be used to assist people who, you know, are in difficulty if they were to come to us? Is that something that's possible?
We don't have funds very much for that. We are trying to be very flexible with people that have need for the programs we already offer, so that we can either you know, delay charging or provide scholarships and that kind of things. But it's really, I think it would need to be quite a conversation with council and about how to do something more substantive.
Okay.
As much as I would love to help, it's a tough one.
I think we should try to be as flexible as we can. A few other things, and I'm sorry if I'm taking a long time here. There's a sewage situation in North Tacoma where WSSC has made the repairs, and certainly Ms. Braithwaite has been pushing WSSC, and I think the repairs have been made, but there's still a very intense odor there. And I think the initial feedback was it just had to get washed away. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like it is getting washed away, and there was some uncertainty in trying to read through the email exchanges whether the state did or didn't allow steps to be taken. And I don't know if we know the answer to that, but it's pretty bad for the people who live there, so it'd be really helpful to be able to find out. I'm not sure why, if a company was at fault with that, the answer after they fixed it would just be to leave the stuff there and have it wash away. That doesn't strike me as making sense, but I'd love to get a definitive answer on that. On the utilities, which Councilmember Costick also mentioned, I mean, I think her point just illustrates why trying to do this on an ad hoc basis just doesn't really work. And we need to have some more general guidelines, and I understand the challenges with that, even with PEPCO, which has started doing their 3-week look-aheads, but their last 3-week look-ahead was on December 9th, I think, so we're into the next period, and I don't think there's a look-ahead. And Washington Gas, I don't know anything about them, and that's disruptive too. So again, I've mentioned this repeatedly. I hope we're going to be taking some action on that in the near future, but I think that's a good example. You know, an emergency situation like on New Hampshire Avenue, maybe that can happen, but there still should be some sort of indication of what's happening there. And just a couple of more things. On January 22nd at 7 p.m. here in the atrium room, that's upstairs. You will be able to get upstairs. There's a meeting for Ward 1 to talk about council priorities as we, in the lead up to our own priority setting work. And then I did want to ask the city manager, the Neighborhood Development Company has submitted these documents to the county process. No one's really seen anything yet, and I'm just starting to wonder like where that stands. Even if they're first drafts, are they not something that we can see?
Well, I mean, I saw them when they sent the portal over to us, which was a fairly temporary portal. It was similar to what we had seen before, but we're waiting for the to finish kind of going back and forth to see a real document, so we can go through with that fine-tooth comb to make sure that it meets the council standard.
Is the back and forth involve our staff also?
No.
So our staff are not seeing these things or working on them at all?
Not for this point. This is because we're not the experts on what the county needs to meet the criteria for their complete application.
So if if they submit something that's inappropriate and the county makes them change it, we would never know that, or?
We may or may not know it, right? But I mean, I think it's not official to us. It's not. So I think we're waiting to see what there is.
Yeah, can I just get a point of clarification? So what the county staff is doing is making sure that all the documents are received and that they all meet the county standard for an application, rather than reviewing them for the purposes of approving the development.
That's right.
Right. Just making sure.
Yes. So this is not on content. This is not in the substance of the content. It's just are all of the pieces that need to be included in what's really a very large application is there.
But would you say that's not a public document at this point?
Apparently, it's not a public document. We did check on that, and it is not a public document. It's a working document. So that's a different level, different standard.
And is that pretty typical?
Yeah. It is. It's the standard process.
All right, I'm going to think some more
I'm
about
hoping that it comes out soon, so we all go back and do that fine-tooth comb work. Obviously, it's still, we have lots of stick related to that, but it's something we do need to wait and see what that whole package is.
But I mean, can we ask NDC to share it with us, or was there a reason why they wouldn't want to?
The difficulty is when you're going back and forth changing things, then a previous version is the thing that starts getting routed around to people, and it gets confusing. They may have seen that they put out something that was incorrect or didn't meet the standards, so then they...
I guess the problem, I understand that makes sense, but the challenge is that with the square footage having looked different in a number of different instances, I think that...
That's why we want to see that what they finally settle on, so that we know what to look at. I think when you're looking at a variety of different things, it adds confusion. So we should be getting an answer relatively soon, and that's the best I can say at this point.
I would like it if we could ask them as soon as possible.
We've been talking with them.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman DeBala?
Yes, thank you. Ditto on the thanks to Public Works, and also on those couple of places that needed special attention after the fact. Thank you very much for that. Because nothing, with that much going on, nothing's going to be perfect the first time around. I was also going to bring up the utility blockade on New Hampshire Avenue this afternoon, because I heard about that from several residents. I wanted to specifically mention the Martin Luther King celebration, because, were you going to?
No.
Okay.
Not in my head, yes.
So Monday's Martin Luther King's holiday, and there's as there has been for several years now, there's a 3-part celebration. So in the morning, weather permitting, from 10 to 12, there are outdoor work sessions. There'll be a call probably Saturday morning if the weather will not permit, which it may not this year, which that would be the first time. But there are 2, put it down, there's 2 sites, Tacoma Woods, and on the other side of the city, Hillwood Manor Park, which goes right down to Sligo Creek. So that stretch of Sligo Creek for trash pickup and invasives work in both places from 10 to 12 on Monday. There is a food drive, keying off of what Councilmember Seaman said. The food will go into the Adventist system that you just described earlier. The food drive will have, you can bring food to the dinner, you can, which I'm going to get, that's part 3. You can bring food to the dinner, you can drop it off at Ace Hardware, this building, or the co-op from this weekend on through next weekend. So this weekend and then after that for a few days. And I think as we learned this past weekend, a lot of federal workers, furloughed workers, are really needing assistance. So this is an extra reason to donate this year. The third piece of it is a celebration from 5 to 7 at Tacoma Middle School. A community potluck and celebration of Martin Luther King's life. So hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilwoman Searcy.
Thank you, Councilmember DeBala, for mentioning the MLK celebration. So I look forward to seeing everyone there. Want to just echo my fellow council members in appreciation of Public Works staff for clearing roads. It was nice to, I went to school in upstate New York, and I learned to sleep to the lull of snow plows. And it was very reminiscent of my time to hear the snow trucks. I was like, yes, this means we'll be able to hit the roads in the morning. So thank you so much to Public Works staff. Also just want to thank staff for a very enlightening meeting on Friday about New Hampshire Avenue with representatives from Montgomery County as well as Prince George's County. My hope is that we can, again, follow up with our lobbyists in terms of trying to identify concrete paths forward for not just talking about the challenges that are plaguing New Hampshire Avenue, but actually coming up with concrete tasks that we can work with our colleagues, not only within Montgomery County, but also Prince George's, to try to come up with a concrete path forward and some very specific asks. So I look forward to any readouts, additional readouts from any notes that I have, but also any next steps that you all are able to share. I would appreciate that. For residents in Hillwood Manor, I am working to schedule a meeting with Montgomery County staff, staff that deal with stormwater management, as well as playground staff. We have all agreed that it might make sense for us all to just get together and meet at the playground to talk about the path forward for Hillwood Manor Park. So we are still working on that. It looks like the 25th may work, but I will definitely let residents know. Daryl is a part of that email chain, so I'll definitely continue to follow up with her to see when she's available as well. And I think that is all I have. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you. I just want to add my thanks to Public Works for all their great work, and also thank the Snow Angels, all the volunteers, and Mr. Gehring at Tacoma Park Middle School for getting out there. I think everything was covered twice, which is wonderful. And thank them all, and just encourage people to sign up. You can go on the city website and you can sign up to be a volunteer. There is a wait list of folks who would like to add their house to the list for the Snow Angels, and I think this is not going to be our last snowstorm this season, so even this week. So if you find yourself having a little extra energy and like to shovel snow, please consider adding yourself as a volunteer for the Snow Angels. I think everything else has pretty much been said. I just want to give kudos to my colleague, Councilman Kostick, who in one day not only had an answer from Councilmember Todd regarding Washington Gas, but also got a response from MNCPPC, which I gotta say is remarkable.
Miracles do happen.
They do. I was like, I don't know what you were doing that day, but you had the touch. So congratulations. Yeah, you did. So I'll turn it over to the city manager now.
Thank you very much. Wanted just to note, we were one of the top 5 finalists for a racial equity grant through the Greater Washington Community Foundation. We in the city of, and the county of Fairfax were one of the applicants. We weren't selected, but we were really pleased to be considered, actually almost to be sought out for our work. I know that the mayor and the deputy city manager met last month with the representatives of the awarding organization, which is the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, and the Greater Washington Community Foundation. And it is impressive we made it as far as we did in the process, but also it's been nice to hear the feedback that folks still want to work with us because of the work that we've done so far and our commitment to addressing racial inequities. I just want to mention that budget prep is underway. I think I've got maybe 30 unanswered emails. I apologize. Been in meetings all day with staff. This is the season when we really are focused internally on doing our research, preparing the information that is to be responsive to your interests before you get into analyzing the budget. And so I just wanted to give that heads up and put that into context for folks. It's a little harder to schedule meetings. It's a little harder for us to immediately respond. We still will try to respond rapidly, but it does add a dimension. Thank you to your comments about the winter weather response, and it was great talking to some of the Public Works crews who are happy when they can come and help save the neighborhoods. They do get frustrated with cars that park outside of the kind of away from the curb or right on a corner because they don't want to hit them, and it takes extra work. They did a lot of hand shoveling and snow blowing on sidewalks and curb ramps. There's so much more to do, so we appreciate their work, but also a number of residents that have come to our attention that have worked really hard also on those curb ramps. And know that it does take a team to get the city clean. In talking with our neighborhood services team, I asked, well, how did it go when they go out to inspect sidewalk clearing? And they said it was great. They were really thrilled with how well the sidewalk clearing was done by residents. They did issue 31 warning notices and 15 citations, but given the whole city, and the work that they did, that's a very good number. The citations were for $25. Sometimes people get a little bit concerned because the violation notice that gets put up, which is one of these, mentions that the fee can go up to $200. That's if you're a repeated problem and you don't do it. So just want people to know that we want them to clean it promptly. It's easier if they clean it promptly. But the initial cost is $25 if they do get cited, and we trying to be fair and about that. Cleaning doesn't always mean it's not icy. I'm not going to cast aspersions on the person who cleaned my driveway, because it was me, and still didn't help. And the forecast calls for a bit more wintry weather this week. So we do need to be careful to continue to do the de-icing, put the sand down, besides shoveling where it's continued to need. And it looks like it's going to get really cold next week. So any opportunities to do that final cleaning really needs to be taken advantage of. I appreciate the kudos. I also have the kudos for the public works staff. They did a great job. Our new communications specialist got a crash job in how to get the word out about snow, and she's like, I didn't realize how much was involved. It was interesting talking with her afterwards that, from the outside, she knows, oh yeah, the crews are out, they clean the streets. But until it was the back and forth and hearing about it, she really didn't realize how big of a production it was and how things change over time. So it's kind of nice to hear from a fresh set of eyes about what's involved. We did get a commendation on for Private First Class Sims, who helped shovel out an elderly woman on his way to work. And so that was something that got called in, and we appreciate that our staff tries to help out wherever they are, whether or not they're within the city. A couple other kudos that we received for officers. One was to Private First Class Merriman, who did one of our home security checks, and it was very well received. People should know that that's one of the things that we do. We come out and see, how safe is your home? What are the things you can do to help protect yourself? And it's nice that this person noted that she did this while also not being alarmist about it. So that's a nice specific comment to hear. And then Private Hernandez and Private Antis helped do chaperone somebody on a ride along, and that person appreciated that. That's also something that people can do in our city, and it's a nice way to see our community. So it's good to hear the kudos. As we look back over the storms and the ones to come, I think there are some things that we want to always tweak to make our response a little bit better. And I think there's some interesting comments that I've heard about how we can report some things in a better way. It's going to take a while to work on them. I'm not sure we'll be able to jump right in on those, but if you have ideas, please forward them to me. I appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Great. All right.
Oh. I'm sorry, I had one more thing that came in after I wrote this. I did get a call from the staff to the Tower Commission. Since the time thing switched, the FCC's date, they have suddenly received 41 applications, and 3 of which are in Tacoma Park. And it looks like we will be able to have a staff person on the Tower Commission. Right. But yes, now that folks waited for that date, and so that they could be part of the shot clock process, and they've jumped right in, and I think we're going to see a lot.
Great. And when are the Do we know where the 3 applications are? Is
no,
that up yet on
they're supposed to. I just found out late this afternoon. They'll be sending information.
Great. And one of the things that we had talked about after the meeting last week that we'll be getting from staff soon is, but we had the snow event, so that took a little time. But perhaps in the next week or two, we'll be getting kind of a schedule of the process moving forward for the regs. So we don't have it this week. Our public works had enough to do on that to turn our attentions. But just so people know, we were also have been, also looking to engage a consultant to review that as well. And so all of that is moving forward. And we'll keep the council updated and members of the public who are interested in it. So great. All right. Let's move on then to our work session. We have 2 this evening. The first is a discussion of definition of commercial property.
I'm not sure if anyone's going to come up.
Who's
Sarah, would you like to come up, or just want me to do it?
All right, you're doing it.
That's fine. We've had lots of discussions on this. We've been having discussions, obviously, with the council for some time about how should the city consider making up the $320,000 approximately of foregone revenue from the inventory tax portion of the personal property tax as we go into the FY20 budget. And one of the things when the council passed that ordinance to remove that, asked the staff, and I had suggested that we look at, could we change the taxing rate for commercial property to help address, to narrow or cover that difference, that $320,000. And we did a fairly systematic approach about taking your ideas about different ways of how do we define commercial property, how do we define what kind of commercial property might have the resources to pay greater taxes, especially if they were related to those that were saving money because they weren't getting the inventory tax and having to pay the inventory tax anymore. Was there a way to recognize folks who both owned a business and lived in Tacoma Park? We tried to look at all the different kinds of segments of that. We had presentations made to businesses in the Tacoma Langley and Old Tacoma Business Association areas, as well as communicated information to other business owners who operate businesses outside of those 2 districts. We received some very helpful, detailed emails from some business owners about how much they pay for their association, for their trash pickup that's not covered by city, a variety of things that fall into that category. We heard a variety of different comments on how some commercial property owners operate the business on their property. Others, in their leasing arrangements with businesses, sometimes pay the taxes for them and sometimes pass the taxes through to them, and completely varied answers throughout. So there was no simple answer. We also received city attorneys' opinions about some of the thoughts, different approaches that could be taken, and it made it tough to identify a legally viable kind of specialized category that would help some of the businesses that folks were interested in helping. And we also tried to keep in mind, how do you come up with a category that is easy for the county to use when it identifies how to send out the property tax bills? And I can say we cut and diced in many ways, and what we basically came up with was that the simplest thing to do was to rely on what the State Department of Assessment and Taxation categorizes as the property use. And in your packets, in the green folders today, there's a one-page thing that just has this on it. This is an example of a property information sheet from the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. And up in the right-hand corner of that form, it'll say use, and it'll say commercial or residential or whatever that property is. And it's not exact. It sometimes is correct and sometimes it's not, but it's mostly correct. It is something that is available and sortable and kind of machine readable enough for the county to be able to easily use it when it would be identifying what kind of property tax category an entity would fall into. So as we did that, we also came up with, so we collected a lot of information on, in your package, maps of where the businesses are. Online, we have got the assessment data that just came out and showed what the increases in the assessments are for many of the commercial properties. Some of them in the Tacoma-Langley area are 30% increases in this past year. So, that again, they may have some credits and things that they don't pay that full amount, but they have fewer credits than like a residential homeowner has in this area. As we looked through all that, we kind of came down to, for the purposes of this discussion today, we need to know, do you want to establish a definition of commercial property that we would consider assessing a tax to as part of the budgeting process? Whether or not it's different than that, so the residential property tax would be something you would decide at the time, but at least something that would identify that that's a category. And we would need to relatively soon get it over to the county so they can program it. The kind of two suggestions are, if you have no interest after thinking about this and pursuing it, fine, you could say no. If you do have an interest in at least seeing what that means, you could say yes. And it, again, you could lower the tax rate for commercial businesses, you could raise it, you could keep it the same as the others. That's not for tonight for you to decide. As we started really talking about it even today, again, and looking at the sheet, there's all these other land use codes, multifamily residential, there's, residential condominium. One of the things that you might want to consider, and we would, as we come back to you with a resolution of what to forward over to the county, is if you would want to consider some in addition to commercial and commercial condominium, and you wanted to put in their apartments, or you wanted to put in their, those are probably the main ones. Mm-hmm. And that way you would end up kind of having the flexibility in FY20 or in the future to have different tax rates for those different categories. And kind of making, we'd have to have some estimates. We would learn over time about how much we get from those various revenue streams. And then, if there was something that you wanted to apply, you could. So what I would ask is, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but I, at the very least, would like to know, would you like to see flexibility and have some of these categories sent over to the county to set up into their computers for consideration when you set the tax rates in May?
Can I ask a question of fact? Remind me what commercial condominium and commercial residential are.
Okay, so commercial condominium is a condominium property that is for businesses. You'll see that even in the medical building that's next to the hospital.
Businesses. Got it.
Those are commercial condominiums. Commercial residential is a really weird category. I think there's 3 entities, and I think we should just ignore it, frankly. I don't think it applies to us much.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Right now, I'm leaning against increasing the taxes on.
I'm not seeing anything about the taxes.
Well.
But in terms of, you don't want a category, or you do, or it doesn't matter to you?
The only category I think that we should create is breakout apartments. Because you have the smaller units, the garden style apartments, and then you have the bigger units like on Maple Avenue or Houston Avenue. those landlords, the bigger landlord, it's easier for them to deal with taxes than say a guy that has 3 units.
But both of those would be in that category.
But we couldn't break it out into commercial apartments.
No, there's not under the SDAT rating, it's not commercial apartments and not commercial apartments. It's just apartments.
So you can't break it out to the number of units.
No.
Okay. All right. That's it. Thank you.
Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. I've got to find that list again. Here we go. I would be in favor of looking at commercial and not the, well, I was saying commercial condominium too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we would
commercial and commercial condominium, but not any of the others.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just, I want to.
I could go on that, but I'll wait until somebody else suggests that we do one, and then I'll argue with
Oh, I don't necessarily, I agree with those categories, and I would just like to say that even if we don't, when we have the conversation about the tax rate, do a differential tax rate for these categories, I actually think it helps us in our planning and understanding for the future where our tax revenue is coming from. So I'm supportive of, I'm disappointed in a lot of the good thinking that we had done, that we couldn't be more creative.
We tried.
I know. No, I know it's not your fault. I think we came up with some really good ideas. And so that's a fight for another venue. But I think in terms of what we can do, the more information we have about where we are getting our tax revenue from, I think the better we will be able to make decisions. In addition, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're able to break out some of these categories, especially the commercial, we can think about other things we could do, like commercial, like credits to businesses and things like that. And I'm particularly looking at my colleague who has a number of businesses who are going to be being impacted by the Purple Line and other things. And so in the future, having these categories will enable us not to just tax the businesses, but also think about potential benefits we can identify. So I just want to put in, for myself, I would favor us moving in this direction. We can discuss the actual categories.
Okay.
Councilman Searcy, you're next.
Ditto. No, so from a strategic planning perspective, I think it would behoove us to think of ways to more accurately capture those different types of like what we mean by commercial, to the point that the mayor raised, as we are engaging with other stakeholders and trying to identify ways to mitigate some of the negative impacts of the Purple Line. But moreover, if our goal is to try to encourage small local businesses to reside here, then we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure that they can afford to be here and stay here, right? So I do like the idea of us having a more granular breakdown of what these different businesses are. That way we can monitor the tax revenue, how it's coming in, and identify potential ways to implement programming such that we can encourage the development in the way in which we would like to see it happen as a city. I'm not as familiar with every single category here. Some of them just seem weird. But the ones that make a little bit more intuitive sense to me, I would be in favor of having apartments, commercial condominium, and commercial. I don't know necessarily what commercial residential is.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. But in my mind, apartments, commercial, and like that.
And then residential.
And then the residential, yeah. Now, I'm not, and I guess this could be, a question for Ms. Daines. If we were to just say commercial, right, and apartments, like how would that play out? So would it mean like the office suites, which I guess would be technically considered commercial residential. Would that fall under commercial, or would that fall under some of these other buckets?
The office condominium classification applies to the doctor's building that's on the Washington Adventist Hospital. So there's really only that one parcel with all the individual condominium units within there.
Okay.
So if you go through and you look at the list, it's one address with suite number, whatever.
Okay.
The commercial residential is confusing. There are only 3, and I went back and looked at it again today, and I'm perplexed by what the commonality is of all of those, which just reinforces that while this is the best resource or best tool that we've been able to identify, it's not necessarily consistent throughout and would need to be scrubbed, at least over time, to see if everyone is in the right use classification. But it's a determination that's made by the assessor as opposed to being self-reported by the property owner.
And so it wouldn't be a problem for us in communications with the county to try to roll all of this stuff up. Is it the case that commercial, like if you were looking at a Venn diagram, commercial would include these other random? No. So we would have to define.
Separate and distinct classifications.
So we can just pick which ones we want, and we can join them. We can say these 2 go to this category, and these, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it wouldn't be the case that if we said, we would still need to define commercial and make sure that those few different land use categories would fall under that. I'm just trying to make sure I understand when we're talking about different categories, like what categories would we select that would include everyone?
So this probably deserves another round of discussions with the guy at the county.
Okay.
But my takeaway before was we could say the commercial plus commercial condominium ends up to be one category that the county uses. They take everything that has either one of those kind of uses on the SDAT list, and then that's what we apply a certain tax rate to. Okay. And so we could have a whole bunch of them, but I think it's a little bit easier to join the ones that make the most, that really are close together. If I had to choose, I would say apartments. I would have either 2 or 3 of the commercial. I'd probably put commercial residential in with commercial until I figured out some other answer to what that is. And then I would have the 2 residentials, the residential and the residential condominium as a category. The exempt, they don't pay anything. So, it would just be it would be the base rate or something, but they wouldn't actually pay. And
would we ever need to identify those exempt separately or no?
No, those, again, that's a classification that the assessors determine when they place a value on the property. So it's something that they do. Mm-hmm. There are subgroups within those classification or those land use classifications, but unfortunately those are all self-reported. So if I were to suddenly decide that I'm a restaurant owner or an office business and I'm going to pay a higher tax because I'm an office, I could self-report as a restaurant. You know what I mean? So this is one of the reasons why we thought that this particular aspect of the SDAT would be the most appropriate to use, because it's consistent throughout and it is not something that is established on a whim, and it would be easy to track.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense.
And what's the example of a commercial residential, the 3 properties?
There are 3 of them. One looks like it's a residence with a dentist chair in it, or that kind of a thing, where there's sort of an ancillary commercial use associated with it, but it's primarily residential in nature. They're small properties without a lot of assessed value and kind of scattered all over the place.
So we may have to just do some research on what that is. They might be actually mistakes.
Yeah.
Okay. Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah, I favor setting up the separate categories at this time, and I have some questions when we get to setting tax rate about the impact of a number of changes over this past year, increased assessments and properties coming online. I don't think we need to get into that tonight necessarily, but I'm mindful that some commercial properties have received huge tax property assessment increases, and some of those are in the very places where we would like to try to keep small businesses. But I like the idea of a commercial condominium class. And I'm not as clear on whether it's good to have the multifamily broken out also, but not lumped with commercial. That I don't think is a good idea. I did want to make sure I understand, so setting up subclasses for taxing purposes is not easy, but the question about creating a tax credit for some subset of commercial, is that possible in the way that we have a subset of single-family homeowners gets a tax credit? Is
Yes,
that something that we can look at?
My understanding is it is. The issue is simply the work that's involved in identifying who's eligible and making sure how that functions. So, I mean, one of the reasons most of the, maybe all of the tax credits that we have are matching what somebody else already has identified and done the checking of the paperwork, so we don't have to check the paperwork. So that's the only caveat is as we go forward, how hard is it to actually function to get this information and keep it up to date? And how much burden does it put on a business owner, et cetera, to have to file for something? And do some people find out and other people don't find out that they're eligible for something?
Well,
so those are all those kinds of things that, we would keep in mind, but my understanding is that we have that flexibility.
Okay. And I had a question about the information that you gave us tonight. So the map is for this new assessments?
Are you referring to the map in the packet?
Behind the blue paper.
Oh, that's just where the.
Is that the same map we got last time, or is that the map with this?
It's the same map as.
So it's not this year's new assessments?
These are just the commercially zoned, or the properties that have been identified by SDAT as commercial.
But this was before the new assessment.
This was before.
This was before the new assessment data came in.
This is another copy of what we got before. This is not an update.
That's right.
Okay. And then.
And let me just give the caveat that the information we have online that shows the assessments is really interesting information, is before credits are applied, and it's before people have applied to appeal them. Yes. And some of the entities that more often appeal their assessment are the bigger, more expensive properties. So you may see a property and it may have gone up a lot, but they also might be able to appeal and successfully appeal that. So just to let you know, it's until it's after February 11th or something, and the decisions are made, it's got an asterisk on it.
Okay. The other thing to keep in mind with the information included then in that map, it's what the assessed value is as of January 1st, 2019. The actual tax, the number that they would use as far as valuation for property taxes gets phased in over a period of time. So that would be the value after 3 years as far as a property tax.
So that was going to be my next question. So commercial properties also get the 3-year phase-in?
I believe
I think they get the phase-in, but they don't have the homeowner's credit, homestead credit that has any cap on it.
Right.
Right. Okay.
We'll double check, but
They don't have that at homeowners.
Yeah, they don't have the.
Right, but they do have the phase-in.
We rely on them a lot to better reflect the times.
On the ranking of the real property tax charges by select communities, these are all communities that have a different rate for commercial from residential?
No, these are properties that we identified what their property tax rates were on various levels, and then applied an imaginary $500,000 assessed value to see what those properties would pay in property tax under their current, or at that time, current tax rates.
There are very few other municipalities that have a commercial tax rate.
Yeah.
And counties can't do that.
Right, it said that in here. There were a couple in Prince George's County, as I recall, and then of course DC. Okay, And so I am kind of interested in the idea of whether, how much work it would be to do some kind of credit for minority business. And I'm not clear whether it's people who, I asked this last time and I don't know if I got the answer. Is it the property owner, if the property owner rents to minority businesses?
I'll go back and look and see what the
As
attorney,
opposed to the
I think the
property
attorney
owner
was asked some of those questions, but it's, you know, a lot of times these are really tough. Like, who's the owner is really hard to know who's really the owner of certain properties or businesses. There's partnerships, there's other kind of names. So happy to work with you on that, and we can work with the attorney, but sometimes I will just say that it's not that easy.
It'd be easier to determine the business owner than the landlord.
Right, okay.
And the real property tax does not go to the business owner unless they also own the property.
Okay, thank you.
That was part of our challenge when you were doing this investigation.
Anything else? Good?
I think I'm good.
Okay. Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. Thanks for the information. On the categories that you were suggesting potentially we would submit to the county to ask them, that's just for them to
program
show
their
us what they
computers.
would be like, right? And would we get data to see what the impact of differential rates on those would be, or is it just to kind of be ready
No,
if we decide to do it?
we would know it. We wouldn't get it from the county up front. We would just have to project from the assessed value, applying whatever tax rate it is.
I guess I'm unclear on having them program it. That, first of all, if they program it, doesn't mean we've agreed to do different amounts
That's
for
right.
each of those, right? That's just for them to kind of get ready if they.
If you
needed to.
decide at budget time that you want to have some different rates for these different categories, you have that flexibility to do so, and the county computer system would be able to receive that.
But it sounds like 3 or 4 of them are kind of irrelevant, either because there's so few of them or because they're exempt anyway, right? So in that case, would that be commercial, residential, and the 2 exempts at least anyway, would be, wasn't commercial, residential the one that you said there was only
Right, there's
3 of them?
3 of those. Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to just double check with, just go around a little bit more on what those 3 properties are.
Yeah.
But basically, I see commercial condominium, and perhaps commercial residential as one category, apartments as one category, and then all the rest is one category, recognizing that exempt, you don't pay anything.
Yeah. I mean, I would be fine with them just preparing that, not knowing how we're going to do it yet. A couple of other questions. Councilmember Duvall mentioned the credit question. I'm not sure I knew exactly what she was talking about there, not because she was unclear, but because I was unclear myself. But the question I had is, would we have the ability to give some sort of credit in cases just where the assessments had really gone up a lot, or is that essentially what you were asking, or were you asking something different?
Well, let's get the answer to that.
Okay, so let's say, there seems to be a wide variety in terms of the assessments among people I've spoken to residentially, including some who had the letters sent to the wrong address and still haven't gotten them. It's a separate question. But so, if there was a particular commercial property where they had just seen a huge increase, could we help them?
I would need to check with the attorneys to find out what restrictions there may be.
Okay.
I mean, my gut thought is that we could identify a cap for some things. But I would want to run it and make sure that that's all legal and that there's no weird criteria out there.
Because I'm thinking in particular in the cases where, because they have the long-term leases, and we heard from several of the commercial property owners about that, meaning they can't really, in an effective way, pass on any increased tax that they might pay. that might affect them negatively more than it would others, you know?
That's true, but I will say that you have lowered the tax rate year after year recently, so that their tax rates have been going down for several years. So that's, you know, yes. I mean, it's all part of the balance that you have to figure out.
But if we did the division that you were talking about, where commercial was in a different place than residential, in theory, we could pick a different amount.
Yes.
For that. A couple other questions. On the personal property tax, separate from the inventory tax, there's also the piece that relates to some of the equipment that they have, right? Can you remind us, I know we've talked about this before, and I apologize, but, and if you don't have the answer at the forefront of your brain right now, but what's that amount?
What we do is we charge it same as the county does. It's kind of it's actually not very much. I would hesitate messing with that because that's been something that's pretty consistent in this area, and part of it is to try to be consistent.
Right. The only thing there is that with the inventory tax, and the reason why I had originally suggested the idea of just exempting a portion of it at the bottom, I think for the people with the home businesses or the very tiny businesses, those are the people who probably pay a disproportionate way for that tax, right? Because, you know, they're taxed on this equipment that they have at their house, and they just are running a small business.
They might have a copy machine and stuff. But I mean, it's. I guess my view is it's not a lot of money, but I'm happy to.
All right. Well, if we could just get the number, and then just two other questions on the chart that's with the material that shows what the different communities pay. Can you just remind me? So for the county tax rate, Tacoma Park and Hyattsville, in particular, pay more than some of the others, and so. How does the county do that, and what's the purpose for that?
So, how does the county do? So you may be looking at the difference between Montgomery County and Prince George's County. In Prince George's County, they have a split differential instead of just a rebate for tax duplication, and so for many of the municipalities in Prince George's County, they have a differential rate. So there's a base rate, then they maybe get a little bit lower of a base rate because the municipality pays some services, and then they might get a rebate for some of the other services.
But even with Montgomery, so Rockville and Gaithersburg have a lower rate than Kensington or Tacoma Park. So
that's because. So the other part is the county, what's not all identified in here too, is that some have, that number actually includes the MNC PPC rate that doesn't cover, say, Rockville and Gaithersburg, but does cover the city. So there's other taxes that are kind of lumped under the county tax rate that are the county plus leaf collection, and there's like a urban district, and there's a couple other taxes. So if we gave you the full chart, it'd be really wide, and so we're in an area of the county that gets more services than, say, Gaithersburg or Rockville, because they have their own planning and zoning and parks.
So if we had this tax duplication addressed, this would be less of an issue, right?
Absolutely.
And then the one other question is, I mean, it sounds like there have been issues in the past, and I just heard from residents who had their notice sent to the wrong place. How confident are we, or should we be, of the SDAT data? And we've had cases here where, you know, it didn't always match up properly and so on.
So my sense is that SDAT data is for homes is pretty good. That's not to say that might not be a problem with how they, you know, what the name and the address of the owner is, if that's correct on their files. For businesses, that was really not good information. That's why the personal property tax and inventory stuff was really a mix. So I think it's better than the comptroller's information was previously on income tax, but it's not 100%.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilwoman Costick?
So within these categories, where would it fall if we were to create a vacant property tax?
Actually, Ms. Daines is going to answer that. We've had some interesting discussions about that.
It would be a separate tax and would have to be clearly defined as far as to which properties that particular tax would be applied to. Right now, the city of Mount Rainier has that tax in place. So we've been watching them to see how it's going. There've been some bumps in the road, but we've been told that those have been worked out. And that is one of the options that could be considered as the council goes forward in terms of identifying future ways of recapitalizing the housing fund, if you will.
Did you find out some information about how they actually assess those properties, though?
It's based on a evaluation criteria that's determined. So they go through, and one of the things we've been trying to avoid is to have to go through and inventory all of the properties in the city every year, and with their property tax ID numbers and all of that, which creates some challenges. But with the vacant property thing, or vacant property tax approach, it's very specific and discrete. And it also ties back to a registration process that is developed in partnership with the code enforcement as well as the others within the Mount Rainier community.
Great.
Go ahead. So I just want to make sure I'm clear. So would it necessarily be an additional category here, or is it more like a fee? You know, is it a tax where it's an ongoing thing, or is it a fee? Like, you could have been in category 3 up until the point where your business shut down and you haven't sold yet, and then you move into this vacant category.
It would have to be considered a tax. Okay. Because the way the state law is set up, municipalities like Tacoma Park can only charge fees that are equal to the amount of providing that particular service. So right now, the registration fee for vacant properties is quite low, but it's based on the estimate in terms of the amount of staff time that's required to process and monitor that property based on its registration requirements. So whereas if you do a special tax, you can, $10,000, $100 worth of value. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you can create more of an incentive to return that property to the more active inventory.
Okay. And so we would need to make it a category here if what we want is for it to be
I would not recommend doing that as part of this conversation. It would have to be more in-depth discussion at a future work session. I would think it's up to the city manager in terms of identifying exactly how those properties are identified. Though you probably could.
I think we could.
Yeah.
The issue is more that we would have to, in identifying with the county, we would have to have an agreement with them that we would be providing them the addresses.
Right.
And then we would, have to figure out what happens if it's a half a year, or, that's just one of those tricky, that's more like a logistical thing as opposed to the category. So it's a possibility.
But if you still wanted that tax to be a part of the county, like the whole purpose of us doing this.
Right,
like
so we could identify vacant, we could identify vacant as a category, but then we would just need, as part of our agreement with the county, to say but it would be vacant until we provided the address.
The address, okay.
Makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like, if we could do that, I would support creating that category so that we can move forward with that. It looks like I have a couple other comments, but go ahead.
A question about that. So that would be like an extra tax that would be applied to vacant properties? Is that what we're talking about?
It would be a higher tax. So they would move out of a residential category and instead be in a vacant category.
And then if because of that they thought, oh, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to just have somebody live there, it could come back down again, right?
Right, that's what I'm saying. It would take a lot of logistical thought about how it would work.
But it could be based on our vacant property or ordinance that we passed 4 years ago now. I mean,
right.
So I mean, we've done a lot of that thinking, and
it's an involved process, and when
Right.
I first responded, I was focusing on that particular process. But it does make sense to consider including it as a classification now.
Just not knowing how we would
When you
figure
say
out exactly how it works.
When you say vacant property, you're saying a vacant improved property, right? Not a empty lot.
It would be up
It would
to us
be
to
a-
define
Undeveloped
it.
lot.
It would be not a vacant lot. Right now, vacant lots are not considered, empty lots are not considered vacant properties under our current code.
Right.
Thank
So, but the issue is that's under our code. So if you wanted to change the definition, you could do so. We would need to provide a definition for what goes on that once we so that we could identify the addresses.
Just didn't want to get trapped, thank you.
So I, in addition to that, would support creating the additional categories that we discussed with commercial condominium, apartments, and the other ones as well.
Okay.
And I like the idea of looking into credits and seeing what we can do. But I also think I liked the point that Mr. Silverman made earlier regarding the services that the city provides to businesses and the benefits to being in Tacoma Park. And the more that we can communicate that, but also looking for opportunities maybe to offset some of the impact on some of the smaller businesses through providing additional services or assistance to them, maybe not as a credit, but some other sort of function, I think would be useful.
Great. Councilmember Smith?
Looking at some of the taxes that the district has for their property owners, they also have the blighted property tax. Can you talk more about that? Is that, no, okay.
No.
All right.
I know enough to say, yes, they do have one, and we can get more information about that.
Okay. And another question is, their tax rate is based on the increase of assessed values, I guess. Have you talked to their landlords and see how they feel about that? I mean, with all this development going on in the district, and it seems like that's the only place that has that type of tax system for property, why is it, I mean, somebody must like it, or do they just put up with it?
If I might summarize the general comments we received from the business and property owners that responded to the proposal, nobody likes higher taxes. So,
I mean, in DC, they know they have a market. They know they have convenience. I mean, there's those.
Right, but was their tax the same at one time as the way it is in Montgomery and Prince George's, and they made this change?
You know, it's been different for it's been different for years. And it's also just strange because it's a state, a county, a city all in one. So, you know, it has its own issues that are separate. But they've always had a different structure of taxes.
And do they offer a lot of credits, to landlords? Do you know?
To commercial
the
landlords?
Washington, D.C.?
Yes.
I'm not in a position to answer that question.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I will just answer Councilmember Smith's question, talking to Mr. Silverman, since he's moved his business to DC, and he actually promised to write this up for me. He did say that there were a lot more grants and other things available to him as a small business now that he was in the district compared to being in Montgomery County. And so I said, well, here's an opportunity with our new county exec to find out more about that. And so that was one thing. And just to piggyback on Councilwoman Kostick, one of the questions I did ask the city manager actually right before the holiday break was, when we do get to talking about taxes, one of the things I've heard from some of the smaller businesses is the fact that the city does not pick up their trash. Right. Is really burdensome on them for a small business. It's not as much the money as the coordination, the getting the people to come, and then them not being necessarily respectful of being in near a residential area. And then sometimes they just don't show up. So that's some of the things I've been hearing from some of the smaller businesses. So It may be, as we're exploring all of these things in the spring when we're doing our budget, thinking about what does that make sense extending some of these services to them. So I think what I heard across the board pretty much is moving in the direction of adding additional categories. Things like apartments, commercial condominium, residential condominium, and for now, a blank category of vacant properties. And coming back from that, having those definitions, and then we'll come back for another conversation about the tax rate.
So what I think we'll need to do, I'll just double check, but we'll probably need at least a resolution. I'm not sure if it would be an ordinance. It'll probably be a resolution because it's a request to the county about creating these particular rates. And so that would need to come back before you, so you would sign that off on those different categories.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Terrific. All right. Now moving to our second item, it is discussion of draft housing and economic development strategic plan. And actually, I realized I think we have a new staff person that only council member Searcy and I have had the opportunity to meet.
We're going to introduce her.
Okay, good.
All right, Ms. Daines.
Actually, I could introduce my two latest and greatest, and incredibly welcome, and I'm so glad they're here, staff members. Samira Cook Gaines, who has this week represents the end of her second week. And next to her is Grace Wiggins, who is our housing manager and overseeing all of our housing and community services divisions. They are both incredibly wonderful, highly experienced, and are taking the ball and just zooming with it, not running. So you will have many opportunities to interact with them going forward as we've continued to work on the strategic plan. I know that Councilmember Searcy and Councilmember Smith and Mayor Stewart have worked a good amount with Grace on a variety of properties in your respective wards, and I'm assuming you is impressed with her at work, as I have been watching. So that we're great. It took time, but we are thrilled.
Right, we're very pleased to have these two new additions to our workforce, and it's also I think notable that HCD's been working without the staff for a long time. So part of the reason it takes a while to do things is that they had some vacancies and had some downtime, and we're really excited that. Are you fully staffed?
No, well,
close.
Next week I'll not be again.
So we're close, but you know, as we talk about the provisions here in this draft housing and economic development strategic plan and go forward into the priority setting budget, I do want to indicate that we have a very small staff, and so we're doing part of this is thinking about what the capacity is for us to do these things and to keep that in mind as we move forward. So, Ms. Daines, why don't we jump into the presentation?
Before I begin, my straw I've had for at least 5 years. So if you see that, it's plastic, but it's concrete, I swear. Okay, so. Cursor. This is the 4th time since the beginning of October that we have met to talk about the city's housing and economic development plan. When we first started this project out in November of 2016, we included both elements, and as the project has progressed, at this point in time the council has focused its energies on the housing aspect of this plan. Again, as I've indicated in past conversations, this isn't a housing affordability plan as opposed to an affordable housing plan, with the intent being to provide appropriate housing opportunities that are attractive to individuals across the economic spectrum, as opposed to focusing on what the definition of which varies from person to person is affordable housing. Essentially, following the issuance of a request for proposals back in November 2016 and the execution of a contract with the consulting group, the Cloudburst group, we managed to go through a whole series of actions, including data analysis, community outreach, and then the development of a preliminary draft plan in a matter of about 7 months, which is fairly tight as far as timing. It was originally presented to the City Council in October of last year, but for a variety of factors, further action on that item was deferred until this past fall, when we've had an opportunity to meet on 3 different occasions to talk about various elements of the housing component. The economic development side of the equation will be coming forward to you later this year. I'm sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. I just wanted to quickly overview what we have talked about since this conversation was restarted in the beginning of October. On October 3rd, we focused on specific housing goals and the recommendations that were included in the draft plan prepared by the Cloudburst Group. 2 weeks later, on October 17th, we reviewed the draft vision statement, which was based on the City Council's council priorities that have been in place for a couple of years, and revised the housing strategy and objectives that were included within that initial presentation, and also looked at the recommendations, because I believe it was the mayor that said this is a laundry list of items, which was in keeping with the scope of services that were included within our contract with the Cloudburst Group. Most recently, on October 29th, additional comment was provided to or solicited from the City Council regarding the vision statement, the housing goal, the strategies, and the objectives. And then we also introduced some proposed indicators to the group. So as we go forward, you're going to recognize a lot of these slides and hopefully much of the text, because this has been an ongoing conversation with input from the City Council incorporated within the document that you're reviewing this evening. What we'd like to do this tonight is to ask you to provide specific direction on how it wishes to proceed with the development of the draft strategic plan as it relates to housing affordability. As I noted earlier, we've gone through and made revisions to the various aspects of the plan, and we'd like you to sort of let us know if we're all on the same page, so that we can go forward to the next step regarding the implementation or development of the specific implementation plan and incorporation of these elements into the FY20 budget. We're also going to be asking you to give us some input on proposed indicators, which will have an impact in terms of how the implementation plan is established and where our focus should be. And then we've narrowed down the list of recommendations yet again, and would like some guidance on that, because it also will impact the implementation plan and, equally important, your FY20 budget. So I'm just going to hopefully zip through these and identify those latest and greatest revisions that have been made in response to the council's feedback back in October. So we have essentially swapped out all of the references to residents with the words people. So we've added of all people, and included embraces rather than regardless of, and incorporated gender and identities and sexual orientation in the group of folks that the livable community is to embrace. We've also added on the very last line safe, so it is a safe, sustainable, accessible, etc., across all socioeconomic groups.
Can I just mention one thing?
Excuse me?
Can I just mention one thing?
Sure.
This is really minor, but I think it should say affordable across all as opposed to affordable all across.
Yep. So I appreciate that. I also want to say that although we missed that one, we really don't want to do tons of wordsmithing tonight. If there are some particular things that are just more grammatical, please let me know. You could just send an email. If there's things that it's just not really what you like, but it's not that big of a deal, I'd prefer that we just move on to the big picture things, because one of the things that we were noticing and actually getting some criticism about was the time we were taking going through all of the comments from the previous council meetings about the different wording. And so where it's really important, obviously mention it, but if there are some like minor things, you can let us know offline and we'll try to address it.
So along that note, this vision statement with that minor revision is generally reflective of the city council's as a whole regarding this particular plan. Okay. If not, raise your hands now. The reason I'm going to end up repeating that is because this really is important, because it will determine where I go forward and what we end up having Grace and her staff focusing their energies on, and the things that we're going to be asking the council to do going forward, particularly from an advocacy standpoint. Regarding the housing goal, that was kept basically intact, though again we incorporated the phrase all people as opposed to residents. And again, this represents your overall housing goal for the community. Okay.
Go through. I mean, I think we'll need to head back through again. So
okay, that might be the most efficient way. Regarding the housing strategy, we included at the request of the mayor the phrase racially equitable in the first paragraph. We've incorporated a reference to a range of quality housing at the request of Councilmember Smith. And again, we've swapped out all people for references to residents. In the second bullet, we've included the reference to walkable and bikeable neighborhoods.
Can I just make a point about that? I would like to see us switch out bikeable for micro-mobility because, you know, I mean, this whole scooter thing, I know you guys have heard me talk about it 1 billion times, but it is going to be the biggest disruptor that we are going to see.
I was just reading something today, and that is now the new terminology for that.
So what is it? Micro-mobility. I will just say that it also, it may be the right thing to put in here, but a regular reader needs to be able to understand it. And we also, as we get down to the details, we can be like very specific about all, you know, it can include scooters, it can include da-da-da, so that we can be clear. So just.
And the focus of this, frankly, is going to be on the housing aspect of it. Those are descriptors for the neighborhoods within the community. In housing objectives, rather than creating, we're ensuring homeownership and rental housing opportunities.
Before we go on.
Oops, I'm sorry.
I just, we talked about this last time, and I just want to make sure that we all agree that preservation and development does include not just new construction, but redevelopment, renovation.
It includes everything.
Right, okay. Thank you.
We're ensuring rather than creating homeownership and rental housing opportunities. Again, we've added bikeable and the word welcoming in the interest of encouraging new people to consider the community as a home. Here we've there was a suggestion that we include at all price points as a terminology, but I've swapped that out for across the affordability spectrum, which seems to be a better fit for this particular document. And we've, rather than facilitating moderate and higher density infill development, we've changed the words to encourage the construction of new, et cetera, et cetera. And the last housing objective, which is focused primarily on the City Council at this point, we've incorporated reference to the federal decisions regarding policy and legislation and funding. So those are the housing objectives.
Sarah, could you just give us like
2 minutes just to be
Think about it,
reflective.
yeah.
I would like council just to take 2 minutes to think about this because, and look this over.
On the
2
very
minutes.
back page of your agenda packet is the language in a text and probably much more readable format.
Just the objective.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry. We good?
I'm good. Folks good?
I have one question going back to this point about renovation and redevelopment. So we ensure home ownership and rental opportunities, we maintain the housing stock, we provide access to a variety of housing types, we encourage new construction, and we advance these goals. And so, is it just me? Where's the part about maintaining and renovating or redeveloping, actively doing something about?
That will come, it'll be more clear in the recommendation steps and in the or the indicators that are
So which one are you looking at? So should you go back to
Well,
one?
either the second one or the
So go back to this,
fourth one.
because it has like the preservation and,
This is maintain
Right,
the
that's the
long-term
strategy.
affordability right there.
Right, so, okay.
So you're talking about the
the
housing
first,
strategy?
you're talking about the first bullet here?
I was before, and now I'm on to, because that was implied, so now I'm looking at the objectives. And again, that word renovation or redevelopment or active maintenance is implied but not explicit. And I just want to raise for people if we want to be explicit about it, since most of what we've got is already built, and most of what is already built could use a little help physically.
So are we looking at the
So go,
maintenance of
go
the
down.
long-term affordability and physical condition of the existing
That's,
housing
yeah,
stock?
I'm thinking if we're gonna add something, that would be the place to do it.
So go forward on your slides. I mean, the other way.
That one?
No, it's that one. It's that one right there. Go one,
Oh, so you were at it?
Objectives,
yeah.
I
so
missed-
second objective.
The second objective.
Facilitates public and private, that one?
Maintain the
Oh,
long-term.
maintain the
yeah.
long-term affordability and physical condition of the existing housing stock.
Again, it's implied, and maybe that's okay with everybody. I'd feel better if it was more explicit, but if I'm
And
the
you want
only one.
explicit what? The,
What do you want to say?
don't words, what do you want to get in here?
Actively maintain or maintain and redevelop.
So you
or
want to
something
show
like that.
improvement,
Yeah.
because
and-
this doesn't imply improvement.
Correct. And the indicators talk about the reduction in cost to homeowners and renters, which is very, very important.
It went off the screen.
I can come up with this language that sort of reinforces when that was drafted, it was, the intent was in terms of not only improving the condition of existing properties, but also maintaining properties so that they will continue to be habitable and attractive and affordable and in good shape.
Right.
Which is reflected later on as we go through the recommendations and the indicators, but I can include some additional language that.
Yeah, let's not hang everybody up on this. But some sense of actively working for improvement.
I mean, Councilmember DeBala, I think some aspects of what you're looking for may be captured in some of the prior stated objectives that relates to encouraging the construction of new and moderate density infill, in addition to maintaining, the affordability and physical condition, which implies quality. So I think what you may be, and then also offering a variety of housing types across the spectrum. I think all of those pieces together may kind of get at what you're looking for, which is not just saying we want to keep it how it is, but we want to take some steps forward in terms of making some necessary improvements. I mean, I do agree with you in that if you're looking for something that is very, very concrete that may relate to, how are we going to necessarily increase the density and encourage the development of new housing across the spectrum, I think, there's the recommendations, but there kind of isn't that much there just yet. And I think part of the challenge is going to be kind of going back to some of the meetings that we've started to have now with folks in Prince George's County as well as Montgomery County, and talking to our lobbyists and trying to figure out what we can do to try to help those that will be impacted by the Purple Line. It's going to take like a more in-depth strategy, like do we want to bid? Do we, all of those things, those conversations we'll have to have in order to come up with some concrete actions that would fall under this development and redevelopment category, if that makes sense.
The other thing is that I think this one bullet point that says maintain the long-term affordability and physical condition of the existing housing stock applies to single-family homes as well as multifamily. And so often when people think affordable housing, they think multifamily. And we're trying to look at preservation across the city of affordability in different ways of all these different types of housing. And so I think that there was some worry of folks that we were going to tear down single-family homes and start building, townhouses and whatever. So then part of this is like, let's maintain of this current housing stock. How do we preserve and maintain and keep it affordable? And so it's, as we get into the details of the different things that we measure, that's part of it. But I understand your point as well. So we may end up coming back with some language on it. But when we talk about existing housing stock, we're talking about all kinds of housing stock.
Right. So let's give it a try.
So Councilman Costick, did you have something?
Yeah, I just had a quick thing, and we don't have to debate it in depth now, but I was looking at the sheet rather than on the PowerPoint. On the first objective, ensure home ownership and rental opportunities are available in a welcoming, character-rich, walkable, bikeable neighborhood. I think the welcoming is going to be really hard and next to impossible to measure. I understand the point behind it, but I think in terms of an indicator on that, I'm not sure what that would be. So I think that's just something to keep in mind.
Right, I think we added that in because that was a council request to add it in. But in terms of how we measure it, yeah.
I actually think there are ways we could measure it. I mean, right now we're a sanctuary city. We translate our website into a number of different languages. We belong to a number of different coalitions that work internationally on that are called Welcoming Cities initiatives. So I actually think there may be ways that we could come up with measurements for future councils if we wanted to. I mean, I'm not wedded to keeping it there, but I do think there are ways that we can actually measure are we a welcoming community.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
You say, "Oh, you're not being welcoming."
All right, I think these look awesome. Thank you.
Can I just bring up another point?
Sure.
And this just came through. I saw notification on my iPad that Microsoft is investing $500 million in affordable housing in Seattle because it's just such a problem.
Do they feel guilty?
There was a time when Washington Adventist Hospital used to actually invest in the local housing. The apartments they're condos now, but they used to be owned by the hospital. Does it make sense for us to talk about that if, for example, whatever happens to that campus, whether it's a single user or the university takes it, that we advocate for or say in this document that we would like you, not just for the university's instance, to have dorms for kids, but that they should invest in housing for their faculty. Does that make sense to you?
And honestly, I believe that between the vision statement, the strategy, and the objectives that have been defined here, that really does do a lot to establish the framework for going forward into the recommendations and the indicators that we have.
Okay. And in fact, the little line here on this screen is supportive actions by public, private, and nonprofit partners. So part of this is how do we facilitate that? Because I think we are going to have everybody help.
Yeah.
Right, because if the university does take over, there will be pressure on, our local single-family housing stock.
Yeah. And that just reinforces one of the things that I was hoping to emphasize later, is that the city of Tacoma Park is a wonderful place. It's 2.1 square miles. You have 2.4 square miles, excuse me, and are able to do a lot of things with the budget that you have, but you can't do everything for everybody. So the only way that this is going to work is if we actively partner with those resources that are available out there, be it the hospital or the university, be it Amazon or nonprofits. But it's going to be something that's going to be critical going forward if we're going to accomplish any of these things. Because even with the housing fund as it's currently capitalized, it sounds like a lot of money, but when you actually start doing stuff, it is not going to be able to do a fraction of what we're hoping to, what we're aspiring to do.
So before we move on from the goal, objectives, and strategy, whatever, goal, strategy, objective, any feedback from the staff as you've worked on these over the last couple of months? Because you're the ones who are gonna have to really be working with them.
At this point, up to this point, this is very manageable, very doable, sort of a given in many ways. Where you're going to see a lot of staff interaction and perhaps some of our bias or experience showing, it will be in the implementation plan in terms of what we think is doable from either a resource capacity to political, to here are the options that we think are manageable or that we can mold to go forward to accomplish these goals.
One of the things that I think are agreeable is what we've talked about so far is that this helps set us a really good base for things, because one of the things that we have found, and part of the reason the beginning of the presentation each time is what we've gone through, that we've met with the community or whatever, is that as we get into later in this council and future councils, coming back to why we came up with these things and looking at these gives that reason, gives that basis. So it's helpful if there's a kind of a common ground that says this is where we started, these were our objectives, this is why we're trying these things. So it's useful to document it. And I appreciate the specificity about trying to be accurate about it for that reason, because we hope it has a pretty long life. It will change over time, but we're hoping that it really gives a good, strong direction.
And many of these things will take a very long time to do. So when we
Mayor, could I ask you a question? Yeah. I just wanted to ask, since I understand sometimes these materials take a while to prepare, but I don't know about everybody else. I didn't have a lot of time to look at these things. Are we planning on indicators or recommendations to try to make decisions today? Because I personally don't feel like I'm ready to do that. I'm not sure what the thinking was here.
Well, I think on what we just discussed.
But we just discussed.
I mean, because that was already in our packet.
I'm okay with what we just discussed.
Okay.
I'm talking about the indicators and the recommendations because.
So I would say, just like Ms. Daines laid out when she started her presentation on the indicators, I forget the exact words you used, but we're going to continue the conversation tonight on the indicators. I think soon to finalize them. I don't think, given it's 10:02 tonight, that we're going to finalize the indicators tonight, and we're just hearing more about the recommendations in the implementation plan. So
right, so
that's to come.
What we keep trying to do is to finalize. I mean, it's not ever final, but work towards agreement on these, because at the same time we recognize we actually have a fairly short turnaround time for some of the implementation materials and budget recommendations for you to consider for FY20 budget. And so you're not voting on this tonight, but those things that you can kind of give a hand vote, or you can kind of give agreement, or you can say, you know, this area we need to really think about some more. Having that kind of feedback is really useful for us so our staff can work on it.
Right. Does that answer you? So we're
it's
not.
kind of a last chance.
It's not a last chance. It's not.
Well, I would wish we wouldn't take hand votes on these things because, I mean, in terms of the community being able to see this stuff, I understand versions of it have been out there, but I don't feel like there's been a lot of time.
That's fine. I mean, and again, it is 10 o'clock at night, and we're just getting to the indicators.
I'd love to discuss all these things. I'm happy to. I'll stay till however late we have to discuss them because I think there's some complex things that we need to get into.
Yeah, no, I'm, I think we can give some direction this evening on the indicators and the implementation plan.
I think the thing that we really want to know is if we're really off base on something here, we need to know it. And that would be a gut feeling more than a feedback from other stuff. That's not to say that we don't want to come back and have further discussions and have you think about these and talk with your constituents, et cetera, and come back, because we want that. Why don't we go ahead with this, and then let's just keep working, stabbing away at it and see.
Do you want feedback on indicators now?
Let's see, why don't we see if we can go through them quickly and then go back to them? Would that, do you want to?
So the indicators that are on the slides and that are included in the materials that you received were presented on the 29th of October. What I have done since the cover memo was prepared and submitted to you is deleted all the specific percentages because
that's where we got the feedback last time.
It's premature at this point in time in terms of developing that because there's been such a so we've eliminated that. What I'm hoping to do this evening is sort of get a feel for, are any of these way off base just generally, or are there things that we've missed that you would like to have considered as a way of indicating or measuring the success that you and future council members have going forward with this strategic plan. The important thing to remember with the indicators is they need to be relevant, they need to be easy to understand, they have to be reliable as far as the data, which also needs to be accessible, like we were talking about earlier with the commercial use for the proposed tax class, and they should be inspirational. So for example, a 10% increase of a certain type of housing in a certain area, that could just be one housing unit. So it's something that needs to be taken into consideration as you go forward because it's not supposed to be easy. So what I'm also wanted to let you know is that going forward, I've included here specific references to wards. And that's to kind of give you a feel for the areas that we're talking about. Going forward, just from a way of benchmarking or noting progress with these indicators, we would include specific reference to the actual census tract or the census tract block group, because that's where we're going to get our data.
And that way, if there's redistricting or whatever, we're not saying, oh, this was the old Ward 3 or whatever, you know, this, it's something that's measurable to anybody who knows how to get to the census data, which is much easier than to try to get to geographic ward information.
And I think it also, I know Councilwoman DeBala and some other folks had some concerns about specifically pointing out some wards and not having all wards mentioned. So I think doing the census tract addresses that concern. So.
And as you all know, there are very distinct differences between the neighborhoods and the wards in the community. And what these indicators have been set up is to try to balance that out so everybody has an equal chance to live in a particular neighborhood, or whether they can own or rent, or whether they can pay $5,000 a month for their housing costs or $150. So there's why there are these aspirational goals that we're proposing to sort of shift that around a little bit to give people equal opportunity to living in neighborhoods that they feel are attractive or address their particular needs regarding walkability or access to the bus and et cetera. So for the indicator or the objective regarding home ownership and rental housing opportunities, that's where we talk about the possibility of increasing or the interest in increasing home ownership rates in some areas and increasing rental housing rates in others where there are higher percentage of homeowners that reside within those areas. From the walkable or the welcoming, character-rich walkable thing, we've included an increase in the walkability scores, which does factor in some of those elements. It doesn't necessarily address the whole welcoming thing, but from a physical standpoint, it could. The other thing that we would suggest is that we not have more than like 3 or 4 indicators for each of these objectives because it may be unmanageable.
You said that before you went.
So of course I can.
I know. I was gonna say, you break a rule. Next one.
I know. And there are ways these things can be consolidated. Actually, this was longer, and I've narrowed it down. So regarding the affordability and the physical condition, which is where we're talking earlier about not only but renovation of existing housing stock, be it rental or homeowner, there's the affordability aspect can be measured quantitatively regarding the cost burden. How much of a percentage of a household's income is used for housing, be it rental or home ownership. So those could be combined as a potential indicator of how successful we're in meeting that objective. We can also look at a way of gauging affordability is the number of units that are priced at affordability rates based on AMI levels. And that would apply to both rental as well as home ownership on opportunities regarding rent versus mortgage payments. We can look at the number of vacant housing units. We could also look at the reducing the vacant or the property maintenance complaints or code violations in various multifamily facilities, and increase the number of biennial rental housing licenses that are issued. Those are issued for properties that are considered to be in good shape, with very few violations that are identified during the inspection process.
Hi.
Again, are you looking for comments now, or you want to go through them all first?
I'm trying to figure that out. Yes.
I could talk now.
Yeah.
So one question that I have about this particular indicator is whether or not is it necessary that we need to limit the decrease in property maintenance code violations to multifamily rentals, or could we also include some aspects of like neighborhood services work where we're trying to help encourage single-family homeowners to also ensure that they're maintaining the exterior of their homes? I don't know.
You could.
How there's overlap there, but I think if one of the big aspects is, trying to maintain the physical condition, I feel like there is a focus on the multifamily, which is important, but, making sure that we can also include single-family homeowners as well as condo dwellers, and trying to figure out a way to ensure the quality of their housing as well.
Yeah. We can include that in, let's focus on 3 to 4 groups of similar indicators. For the, we can include that as an indicator. It would be unfortunate, I don't think it would work very well if you combine them, because with the property maintenance code issues, that for multifamily, that includes interior as well as exterior, whereas with homeowners or owner occupied or condos, unless it's rental, they don't go inside at all, so it's basically an exterior site analysis, but that would be something that could be documented and tracked.
Yeah, I think, and again, I feel like right now what we're doing is boiling the ocean. Because this is a wide net. Hopefully we'll kind of get it down to like a lake, where we've prioritized which areas that are noted here that at least we want to start with in the upcoming fiscal year. But I do think that it's important for us to make sure that we're being mindful of maintenance issues as it pertains to the whole stretch of homeowner types.
And if I can piggyback on the back of that, I would say that it doesn't matter that different types of housing has different inspections, and because you're not comparing one house to another, you're just saying that there's an overall reduction in the number of violations.
True.
And to keep the indicators to a manageable level.
Yeah. I mean, I think we would need to identify some different categories. And so, I mean, I could see just a decrease in property maintenance code violations and just leave it there. But then when we actually implement it, there's a multifamily rental facility, and then there's the exterior of other facilities. We could do it like that.
And then I would also strike the last bullet, because that's the biennial rental housing license is because the violations were lower. So it's unnecessary for an indicator.
I like that idea. I was thinking of that.
We can do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Councilwoman Costick?
Yeah, I agree with I think the purpose of the first two bullets here, but I just have a little bit of a concern because I want to make sure that this is not, you could potentially achieve this by essentially reducing the number of lower income people in the community.
Right.
So you could, you might, by reducing the percentage of people who are cost burdened, by just increasing the income level of people who live here. So I just want to make sure, and I don't know, one of the things I was thinking was if you could add wording that said something like, while maintaining the distribution of income levels. I don't know how you would measure that, but just to keep that in mind or consider a way of measuring this so it doesn't skew in that way.
Right. I think we may have that in a different one, but I appreciate that comment.
But I think that's a concern with many of the indicators is that future councils could manipulate the laws. They could change the inspections.
But that's why the goals up front are so key.
Right.
That talk about who all we're serving and that kind of thing too. But I appreciate
I don't think
that.
they can be perfect. I think.
Yeah. And, you know, one may not have a lot of sympathy for them, but there are a lot of people that are making a whole lot more money than any of us that are severely house cost burdened because of the price of their housing or property taxes or utilities and all of that. So by, we can incorporate in here to provide some distinction. There are different levels of cost burden. There's just cost burden or there's severely cost burden. So that might be a way of sort of gauging what you're, mitigating a little bit of what you're talking about. But again, as the city manager has indicated, even just looking at the number of units that are priced at affordable levels based on a certain percentage of the AMI, that could be another way of offsetting it so you're not losing that access to individuals with lower incomes.
I also think, and I think we talked about this the last time, I think Councilwoman Searcy brought this up, is that, how do we say it? And maybe having some kind of preamble when we have these indicators in one document. I think Ms. Daines kind of laying out your criteria would be one thing. And then also, I feel like the last time we had the conversation in October, we talked about these as, I'm trying to remember the words we used, but as not being having value in themselves, like not allowing them to like have the like the decrease in the percentage of housing cost burden homeowners, like making sure there's going to be more to the story there. I'm not saying this well, but I remember it was.
I don't know what I said.
All right.
I mean,
They're indicators, they're not goals.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Confounding factors that kind of work
That's
together,
right. That's right.
Or against one another, right?
So part of this is, part of the indicators are, what does staff need to keep track of? So that then you guys analyze it and think about it and make adjustments about where you want the steps to go.
Right.
So part of this is identifying what is it that we need to be identifying how to keep track of.
Right. And I think as Councilman McCovar said, indicators aren't the goals.
They're not the goals. No,
Right.
they are a way
And
of
if
measuring
I
success.
think if we have some preamble that clearly states that and states our intent, so we also remind ourselves. I don't think it completely gets to the point, Councilman Kostick, that you raised, that we need to be careful of, but I think at least it helps to reinforce that.
Yeah, I think just in looking at I was using the memo rather than the PowerPoint, but it specifically says we will know we are successful in meeting our housing goals and this objective when. And obviously, I know the reason for that, but I think it kind of indicates that that is the goal then. So some additional language, I think, would be useful.
Great. Did you have something else?
And so some of you might actually be able to help me on that, help us on that. That'd be great.
Great. I have Councilwoman Devala and Councilman McCovar.
Okay, three things on this. One, I'm realizing that one reason this list is so long is because in some ways this objective is two different things, affordability and condition. And so maybe we need to split them out. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I'll just throw that out. I do want to suggest adding another indicator for a couple of reasons. One, it ties into other goals that the council has, and also because I think it can also be measured, to add a lot of, particularly those folks who are low and moderate income in this area are energy cost burdened in particular. And the percentage reduction in utility bill cost burden could be a way to track that and would allow us to think about hitting two different housing and energy goals, climate change goals at the same time. There was a report done in 2016 that looked at a bunch of different cities and utility bills. I think I sent it to you at one point. But there might be a way to work with the sustainability coordinator to see if that can be relatively easily collected, because she may be collecting it anyway.
That would be my biggest concern, because historically, it's like we can't get access to people's utility bills.
And yet during the energy challenge, there was access that there hadn't been normally. So that'd be something I'd suggest we could explore. To see
because it would need to be on a community-wide basis as opposed to each individual customer giving authorization to access their utility.
Right, and I don't know how the group that did the city survey, I didn't look at their methodology. How did they get those numbers? Did they reference some census, another piece of the U.S. Census that tracks energy costs, or did they go to the utilities? I don't know. I'm just saying, if we can figure out how to do that, that ties two goals together.
Right. Theoretically, when they factor in housing cost burden, they include the cost of any utilities associated with that. So it's not just your rent, it's not just your mortgage. So all of the costs associated with your housing.
And then the third thing I wanted to say about this is that in this one you don't have ward or census tracked goals, indicators. You don't have it separated out. And ward or census tract indicators makes a lot of sense to me overall. And I was wondering what your thinking was there. Was there nothing obvious in terms of imbalance between the wards on this one?
It was not as obvious based on the last statistical data that we've got.
Okay.
When you look at renters versus housing, there are some
Yeah,
big
you get
differences
lost in-
between the.
Okay, thank you.
And then here we have indicators regarding various housing types. The 3 and 4 bedroom rental units based a lot on the current population of Tacoma Park. Households of color and new immigrants to the area tend to have larger families and tend to have more challenges finding appropriate housing for the number of people in their immediate or extended family. This is something that was included with not only within our recommendations from the Cloudburst consultants, but is also noted to be a significant issue in the county's overall rental housing study that they've released in the last year. We've included a reference to the accessory dwelling units, which is a fairly affordable way of introducing additional housing that is targeted very specific household type. And then also the registered owner-occupied group houses. If you were to eliminate anything from this, I would do the townhouse units, or you could look at something that's called the missing middle housing, which includes townhouse units, but also garden-style apartments, courtyard style apartments, etc.
And I would just like to note that the 3 and 4 bedroom rental units, or 3 and 4 bedroom units in general, you know, we see a number of families where you've got grandparents and you've got a number of different ages in that groups that need also some support. So as we look at that, you know, that's part of the mix when we look at the data.
I'd like to do missing middle rather than townhouses. I feel like that's the direction that's going in. Councilmember Kovar, I think we missed you last round, so you can start us this time.
Yeah, I agree on the missing middle. Just a couple of other observations. You know, some of the things that are on here may be more difficult than others because they're out of our control, as opposed to just because they're hard. And so there's like there used to be in the diving in the Olympics, you know, the degree of difficulty could give you more points or whatever. And so when you're talking about, for example, in this current one, the accessory dwelling units, that involves a county piece. And so I don't know exactly how we factor that in, but we just need to sort of be conscious of the fact that each bullet point isn't sort of equal in that sense, because some we have total control over. That's obvious, but we ought to just say that. And, you know, it's partly about raising expectations for people. You don't want to necessarily make all these things seem equally doable. They're all worth striving for. And, you know, in some cases, maybe, as Councilmember Kostic said, they could almost work across purposes a little bit with each other. If you're reducing the percentage of cost burden homeowners, you know, there could be different ways of getting that, not all of which we would like. So I think if there's a preamble or whatever, which the mayor mentioned, it ought to be clear that, you know, we're not expecting necessarily to achieve every one of these things to the same extent, if that makes sense. I do want to just, because I didn't realize that we were going to be going block by block, but I'm just a little nervous in the first one about and I know you're talking about census tracts versus wards, but, you know, in terms of, and I missed I was out of town for the October 29th conversation, but on, for example, increasing home ownerships in Ward 4, you know, the danger is that could mean converting to condominiums. And I think in an overall, well, because some people don't want that because they're renting.
I see what you mean.
And, you know, and if we're talking about, you know, increasing rental housing rates in Ward 1, well, certainly we could have more accessory dwelling units if there's not open land to construct a, you know, an apartment building. I just worry that mentioning some of these things this way is going to create things that we won't be able to live up with, or that could have negative impacts. So I think, you know, citywide, we need to try to do these things. It makes me nervous when we start picking the specific geographical areas.
So part of that is, as we get further into this in terms of advocacy about how you advocate for different things. And so part of it is that, I mean, I think when we get into the details of this, sometimes we're looking block by block. So, I mean, you know, some places we might say there's no need to change anything on this block, or, you know, sometimes there are, what we're seeing, and this goes to the conversation of the missing middle, is that there is somewhat of a need for more condominium units to help build home ownership among a number of people who can't right now even get there. And so, you know, so we're looking at as a segment. Does it mean a lot? Maybe not. I mean, that's, we still, she took out all the numbers that said that this is our goal or whatever. My preference is to have numbers in there. We're not to that point yet, but that's, I think that might help get to either ease or compound the angst of this, as I see, you know, are we talking, okay, one building switches and that helps address this, versus, oh my God, it's taking away a whole rental market, which would, obviously we don't want to see, so. But we can't, unless we have some things to measure and to try to talk about who are, what different data group we're looking at, you know, we're not going to get anywhere. We've got to be able to actually look at stuff and try to start matching up some of the needs to some of the solutions.
I don't disagree with that. I just think that this is a recipe for some difficult times.
But the other thing to take into consideration too, if you factor in the racial equity aspect of all of this, there are very distinct neighborhoods where you have high rates of rental housing or high rates of home ownership, and the populations that are living within those areas are very different.
Right.
So this may be a way of providing a more equitable access to different populations for different types of housing types, as well as affordability. So there are a variety, and none of this is going to be easy. But it will be thoughtful, and it will be planned, we hope. Okay, the indicators,
Councilwoman Costick.
Yeah,
Sorry, I just have a quick comment. I don't know what the distribution of the size of rental units is in the city right now, but it strikes me that if one of the goals was mentioned to attract young adults, and I wondered if we might want to look at increasing the number of studio apartments or studio rental units.
We can check and see, look at that.
Does anyone like to? No.
And
Two-bedroom, man, so you can split it, it's cheaper.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And not all studio apartments are created equal.
Yeah.
was there, so again, on this one, even, there's no clear ward or census tract trends, because when I looked at I went back and looked at the original analysis, not the SWOT, but the first one, the data, and there were charts by ward in there, and they looked pretty different to me, which made me want to ask you if you thought that was trying to bite off too much.
When we went through and pulled this together, nothing popped out at me, but we can go back and look.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure either. Okay.
But I have a question as we're having this conversation about different areas of the city. Once we move forward with these and put these in place, as we're looking at the indicators in the future, we can always say, hey, let's look at this broken down by different areas of the city. So just because we're not identifying them doesn't mean we're not going to look at them.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. This document is going to have to be a living document in terms of it's going to have to be embraced, incorporated within future policy and budgeting decisions, but also reviewed on a periodic basis to ensure that it accurately reflects what's going on in the community at the time, and it continues to be appropriate as far as future development. Okay. And then we have our moderate and higher density infill development and redevelopment. Here again, we have references to wards 2, 3, and Ward 6 regarding the New Hampshire Avenue corridor, as well as mid-level, moderate density residential and mixed-use developments in Ward 5 and 6. A lot of that is just based on land availability, some of the recommendations with the missing middle study, the sector plan, corridor concept plan.
So are you thinking that is home ownership or rental?
Here, we're just talking about numbers and actual development and construction. So not all of these things are addressing the same type of issues. Some of them in terms of access, some of it's quality or availability, some of them have more to do with affordability. So it will be kind of across the board. And it's also important to note that, again, this is not an affordable housing plan, this is a housing affordability plan. So there will be projects that kind of run across the whole spectrum, which is a positive thing based on all the information we've had, and is something that's being considered by the county too when they look at potential legislative changes regarding zoning and their affordable housing or housing affordability criteria.
On this one, this is one place where specifying the wards maybe backfires a little bit. So it's also, again, the new construction, adding units, adding construction versus renovating what we've got. So if the objective is to expand the number of units, and there are specific places like the New Hampshire Avenue corridor, what about University?
Yeah, and that's included in Ward 6.
Yeah. Right. And then in wards 5 and 6, what is that? And then the part that makes me nervous is that inadvertently Ward 1 isn't mentioned in this list, and that there might be a time in the future when new construction, new infill would be appropriate, and it's not.
A lot of this is tied to the zoning ordinance.
Right,
and
so
the
I would feel
sector
better
and
if
the
instead
concept
of
plan.
naming specific wards, we named specific places, like New Hampshire Avenue corridor, and said something about it, about the zoning being one reason why specific areas are targeted and others are not.
These, again, are indicators or tools of measuring. We
Right.
can look at that possibility as we go forward in terms of the recommendations and the implementation plan, but providing justification for including that particular measure may not be appropriate within the measure itself. I'm not being very clear.
But you might do it instead of saying by ward or location, just by the zoning codes.
And the availability of land to fill in, to do infill.
We could go back and look at.
I can send you some suggested language you can think about in the morning.
But again, not everybody's going to like all of these recommendations. So you have to look forward in terms of what the overarching goal is in terms of housing affordability and providing opportunities for choice in quality, safe housing across the community as a whole. But we can look at the ward references as well and provide specific planning areas if that's politically more comfortable.
So one of the things about this, though, is that, and this, we haven't talked a lot about this so far this evening, but most of the housing recommendations are key parts of our economic development plan. And these are clearly more economic development than housing need. This is more relates to that than just saying there's a desire for this style of housing. It's more that this is part of our implementation of our economic development goals.
I also think, and I'm sorry, not to go back to my preamble idea, but I do think hearing what Councilmember DeBala and Kovar are saying is, members of the residents are also watching this and looking at this document and going to see this, and I think we need to anticipate how others are going to interpret and receive it, and having what I'm hearing is having the ward indications for someone who hasn't been in this depth of a conversation and thinking about what the indicators are. There could be a perceived imbalance in terms of how we're doing the indicators. So I do think when we do next time present this and talk about it, again, having a preamble that actually specifies a little bit, like, why are we talking about wards at all? Or that we'll be talking about census tracts, or what the goal is here in terms of indicating certain places in the in the city for some indicators versus others. I think will provide that context.
Yeah, I also think that the indicators may be indicating elements of an implementation plan that we have yet to see, right?
Yeah.
So, especially for some of the pieces that relate to, like, you know, infill development and the economic development aspects, clearly there's lots of efforts that have been underway in terms of the new Ave corridor and trying to make the necessary improvements. We've been stomping on this for a very long time. It is something that we have clearly communicated that we want. So the New Hampshire Avenue corridor encompasses certain wards, right? So whether we want to identify these efforts as it pertains to the wards themselves or highlighting specific initiatives that we will have underway, it makes sense. I think this is just, I think the reason why we're like, well, why are these wards, why, you know, which makes sense, is because there's this world in which previous implementation and efforts are kind of colliding with the new development of objectives and goals, if that makes sense, which happens a lot. And so perhaps, you know, once we are at a point where we've identified what these key initiatives are, particularly for this particular aspect, because it relates directly to the recommendation around how are we going to ultimately flush out our economic development plan and strategy and what exactly we're going to do. So I agree that we could probably X out the wards, but it's going to become apparent when we start actually thinking through the implementation plans.
Well, and I mean, in this one, I do think, to sort of contradict what I just said, though, I do think some context in what part of the city we're talking about, because it's true, we cannot have high rises in every part of the community, and I don't want to freak some people out by saying that. You know, I mean, that's just, the reality is that there are some places, because of zoning, because of how built up it is, like, it's not going to happen, and so. Yeah.
I noticed that Councilmember Kovar is awful quiet.
I think specifically, I mean, getting back to my condo thing, number one, part of this is we're advocating to the county. So we could change zoning rules, but I think when you're talking about home ownership in Ward 4, I think we're probably talking home ownership for people living in some of the apartments as opposed to, you know, on Ritchie Avenue. I'm not saying that just because my colleague is sitting there. So the answer might be to say the specific sections as opposed to just say the wards, because, you know, the apartment, smaller garden-style apartments that are along Sligo Creek may be different from the, you know, single-family homes on Erie, and I'm not sure I'm getting my streets right over there. But it's more like neighborhoods and wards, or housing areas and wards that I think we're sort of
I wouldn't also just limit rental to apartments. There are still in the communities smaller houses that are rented. So,
right, but that's not specific to Ward 4.
No, I don't know actually what the breakdown is, but I just wanted to put that, there are parts of our community that
I
still
completely
have.
agree, but then to
Right.
me, you wouldn't just say, let's do it in Ward 4. That's the case, because that exists in a lot of places.
So as we go forward, I think, you know, the comment that was made earlier about talking about census tracts or whatever, I mean, I think we're probably going to be looking down at census block groups. And because census tracts, frankly, can take a big area of our city, which has the same problem as saying a ward. And so, you know, when we find the right unit for these various things, having those be more specific, I like, you know, in a final document, the reason for these indicators should be clear, whether it's a preamble or some other context, that this is why we're trying for these, this is why we're counting these, should be clear, so it is understandable to the resident now and in the future.
And again, I just want to stress, you know, it's okay for us to say our indicator, kind of going back to Councilmember Siemens' point previously made for a prior section, it's okay to say, like, an indicator is that the city has more new housing units, high-rise, blah, 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 blah. period. And then the key activities that would fall on, that would relate to that would be New Hampshire Ave. It would be, you know, to the Crossroads, Purple Line. And then from there, when you're kind of looking at those numbers, you will expect to see increase in those densities and the efforts that you would have underway would target those wards. So although it's important for us to keep track of it at a ward level, it would make sense to do so, we could ultimately roll that up to see how the city is performing as a whole.
And then the last one has been sort of tightened up just to deal with the advocacy aspect, and this is regarding the whole policy, funding, and legislative support that would be required of the City Council, looking at sort of a set-aside for housing affordability out of the budget that City Council adopts every year, tracking the amount of funds that are invested by various partners, and tracking legislation that's adopted that furthers these specific, the overall housing strategy and your specific housing objectives.
I had a question on that. So one of the things that we might explore is working with NGOs or nonprofits, which isn't exactly advocacy in the way that what you've identified here is, because in this case, you're talking about contacting other levels of government or elected officials or whatever. But on the other hand, as opposed to, you know, working with a financial institution where it would be a for-profit one, where it would be more of a financial arrangement, when you're talking about a NGO or nonprofit, there's sort of an element of advocacy in there too. And I don't know whether that just goes somewhere else or that fits into this, or how you think about that.
You could add in the second bullet reference to both public and private funds that theoretically would address part of that aspect.
I don't know what other people think about that, but I anticipate that's something we might want to do, so.
Right. You have a strong point, but I think one of the things about the first two points here, the way that it tends to happen is you contract with an NGO to do something. So whether it's out of your own money or whether it's out of another governmental entity's money, that tends to be how housing development occurs. And so are we lobbying them to be involved? Maybe, maybe not, but they tend to want to be in these loops anyway. And so that's a good point.
I may not go there. I'm just kind of wondering where it would go.
Do we know what percentage of the annual operating budget is put towards housing affordability activities now?
It's been roughly 200,000 for the last 3 years, which is
That's
what
all?
percentage?
Well, there's the amount that we forego because of having rent stabilization.
And the pilots
There's
too, right?
We've calculated this out a couple times.
Well, yeah, okay, so you've thought about how to do it.
But it's hard.
Well, there are a variety of ways you can look at this. You can include the housing fund, you include the lost pilot, you can include the difference in property tax revenue that's generated. So I was just focusing on the housing fund, but there are other aspects of it.
You know, and we obviously have staff and, you know, so we put in a lot of, actually, we spend a lot of money on housing affordability, especially with the, you know, with having rent stabilization.
So
we should be able to, I don't know how soon we can, but we should be able to, as we go through these indicators, define them well enough to know what we count in them and how to calculate them so that then it's comparable from year to year.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so thank you for that. I think going to how we kicked off the conversation, I just want to remind my colleagues, the criteria we were using for the indicators were for them to be relevant, reliable, easy to understand, and inspirational. The feedback we are giving staff is are any of these off base? Or anything missing? We've provided, I think, some useful feedback this evening on doing that. I'd ask, since I know not everyone had a chance to really take a deep look at this, that over the next week, that people look at the indicators specifically with that in mind, and that either we email or we spend some time next week in our agenda just talking about this a bit if people want to, but that.
And it would be wonderful if some people, which people have mentioned that they have some language or have some suggestions, please send it to us, and that way we can like make sure that everybody kind of thinks about it and we think about it.
Yeah, so why don't we do, in the next week, indicators, get that to the city manager and Ms. Daines. Feedback on that. Okay.
You have any energy for the rest of us?
Why don't you present it and then we'll
this
tell
will
you.
Go fast, yeah. And then last, yeah, this is last, but hardly least are the draft recommendations. And if you recall at the beginning of this, I mentioned that the very first presentation we went through the long list of recommendations that the consultant provided for both new initiatives, but also how existing programming could be better accessed or modified to have a broader impact. So we've gone through a variety of conversations regarding what recommendations should actually come of this plan, recognizing that there's an interest in focusing on the bigger issues or the bigger initiatives as opposed to very specific ones. So what you have here are 5 different recommendations. They're all a little different and deal with the funding aspect of it to the advocacy. So rather than detailing specific actions that need to be included within each of these recommendations, I've just kind of identified how it would be, what could be included within that recommendation and incorporated within the implementation plan. So the housing fund is primarily a funding mechanism that would be ongoing, and the funding could be used for property acquisition, housing renovation, or I've included here retrofits or renovations related perhaps to accessory dwelling units. It could also be used to help advance or facilitate infill redevelopment and new development in the various sector plan areas and the corridor concept plans. The second recommendation, which is more programming in nature, is the community land trust concept, which at this point in time I'm envisioning it focusing on scattered site property acquisition that could be used for rental or home ownership depending upon what is identified during the research phase as most appropriate. And that would be something that could be very targeted for specific areas. We also have the development and redevelopment pile of, or pot of recommendation, and that's where you'd end up with your new construction, both primarily infill development, and again in the planning areas, the sector plan, the concept plan, but also in some infill projects that you've seen scattered throughout the community. The subdivision that, for example, that was in Ward 2 up off of Ethan Allen would fall into that category. Large infill redevelopment activity could potentially be the Washington Adventist Hospital campus or the John Nevins Andrews School, or though that's not very large, but it could be the Washington Adventist, or not Washington Adventist, Washington McLaughlin site. And then the biggest change here is the last, or this second recommendation on this slide that I've titled Individual and Organizational Capacity. That used to be, the last time we chatted about this was focused on ongoing programming and services. In working with Ms. Higgins, it's become increasingly clear that there's a need to provide programming and resources to existing organizations that specifically tenant associations, as well as condominium associations, and we can also work with homeowners and home buyers, but to a different degree. The intent being to facilitate the long-term affordability of either the rental unit or the group that the tenant association represents, or in the cases of condominiums, the ongoing affordability of that particular property. Frankly, if you're going to buy a home in Tacoma Park right now and you don't have a whole lot of resources, you are looking at buying a condominium. Housing prices or new acquisition or acquisition of housing is, last time I looked, was like an average of $450,000 for property. Today we were talking to someone who's looking at selling off one of their condominiums units. It's $120 or $120,000 or $110,000. So there's a big difference. So that's one of the reasons why the maintaining the viability and increasing the capacity of condominium associations can be very important, not only in the short term but in the long term, to make sure that those properties are viable and that they continue to be safe, decent options for people who live there. With the home buyer and the home owner programs, those can be a variety of things, from the continuation of the property tax credit program that we have, the down payment assistance, etc. But those are the three groups that we would focus on under this particular recommendation. It's a little new than what we had the last time, but I think it's much more focused and will have a larger impact on significant groups within the community. And then the last one, which has lots of little bullet points, is the City Council in terms of advocacy. And frankly, this is really important, and it's something that you guys do really well, and we're hoping you will continue to advocate for a variety of things. Again, I mentioned the last time we had this conversation about the possibility of including a strategic plan consideration statement in the cover memos, which is sort of continue to remind people that this document exists and that these issues are important. Ordinance amendments, be it the modification of the city's existing rent stabilization ordinance or supporting legislation at the county level that supports some of the missing middle study recommendations or the recommendations of the housing study, and so on as far as planning or zoning actions, conditional use permits, payment in lieu of taxes, a variety of things. Some of this will overlap the economic development side of it, but it also has a huge impact on housing. So for example, one of the recommendations, I believe in the housing study at the county level, is to, there are two that I found particularly interesting. One was a recommendation to modify the MPDU program so that it not focused on the number of units within new developments, but the square footage of the property, so that they could do one 4-bedroom unit and get credit for the square footage of that, rather than having to do 3 1-bedroom units. And then also do a sliding scale as affordability, so that you encourage mixed incomes within these various developments, which is proven to be quite healthy for everybody living in the property. There are also recommendations regarding expanding the development of properties that are currently zoned R60 to include additional residential properties on that lot. This has been patterned after a variety of communities that have adopted or are in the process of doing that in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Portland, a variety of other communities that are looking at some of the same affordable housing issues that the Tacoma Park and the DC region are, so that it would allow for more of that missing middle in housing to be established on larger lots. So if you look at a map, if you look at one of the maps in the council conference room, for example, there are some properties that have lots of land. I don't know if it's flat land, but I do know that from a footprint standpoint, there's a fair amount of property associated with that parcel. So there are possibilities that zoning changes would be going forward that allow for additional development on those sites, which would advance your goals regarding increasing the availability and the mix of the housing stock. It could potentially increase the affordability of that property for those particular property owners. But it's something where, for it to succeed, your advocacy for that particular legislative changes like they're really sort of like three, but the housing fund and the advocacy thing fold into the others. What we would see going forward, if those work for you, is that we would take that information and work towards the development of an actual implementation
like the MPDU program, if you've been, I think, 20 years, you know, then you don't have that discount anymore. So, I mean, there are different kinds of models, and how it moves forward. I think we can come up with something pretty good here. But the other positive thing generally when you have one, and you kind of referenced it, is that it keeps the other adjacent properties from skyrocketing in price in a way. You know, it kind of helps moderate, so you don't have as many spikes up and down. It helps moderate the real estate market in a section.
Last thing about the on the recommended actions, the county's accessory dwelling units, does that allow tiny houses to be incorporated in that, or do you have to?
The current legislation doesn't allow that, but I believe that's one of the options that they're considering. There's staff from my department going to the community meeting on Saturday, and I'm hoping to get more information from them about that, but also to learn more about what some of the objections might be regarding the legislation, so that we can sort of see how we might want to either support them or advocate for adoption of the law.
Let me just say there was a young couple from Texas that moved to Northern California to participate in the whole Silicon Valley thing. They prefabbed a tiny house in Texas, drove it to Northern California, and just plugged it into some random stranger's house that they worked out a deal with them. But there isn't a foundation. They just, it's almost like a mobile home.
It has to be movable.
Yes.
According to the listserv in my neighborhood, if this particular legislation is being adopted, we're going to see an RV in everybody's driveway because of the tiny house thing. The water pressure is also apparently going to just plummet as a result of this. So I'm kind of curious to see what some of the objections are.
But I think that'd be a great option.
What?
I think it'd be a great option, the tiny homes.
I love the concept of tiny houses. I think my husband would not want to live with me after a week, but that's okay. Yeah.
Councilmember Kovar.
Yeah, I had a lot of picky things to say before, but I like where this is all going, and I like the recommendations, the recommended actions. I assume on the housing fund that those are options, because what we have isn't going to cover all of that.
Right.
And you're going to flush that out.
Yeah, these are ways that
yeah.
particular fund could be used.
Yeah, and I was going to point out what you already have talked about, that the county going through this exercise of a zoning amendment for accessory dwelling units is an action that's happening right now that I think we really want to get in on. I think that's great. And I really like the individual and organizational capacity. That makes a lot of sense to me. On the advocacy list, just FYI, I'm particularly interested in property tax credits. I don't want that to get lost in the long list. And that's it. Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. I think the broad categories make sense, and I like the capacity building also that Councilmember DeBala mentioned. I just, in terms of the next steps, so, we've had the vision, we've had the strategy, we've had the objectives, we've got recommended actions. So in terms of programmatic things that could be done within some of these, how do you see, or things that aren't here, when do you see us wanting to do those kinds of things? Because there are some things that we've mentioned over time that aren't reflected here, and other ideas that we have, or that I have anyway, that aren't reflected here because we were busy with the bigger picture part of it. So how does that fit in, and so you have recommended actions, then what comes after that, I guess, is what I'm trying to understand.
That will be through the development of the implementation plan. As I don't think I mentioned it, but a lot of this stuff will take, there will be overlap within different recommendations. So they'll have different, say we did an ADU retrofit program, that could overlap several of these recommendations. There are some things that are going on within the department already now that we have the staff and have been working towards this that will facilitate the implementation of some of these recommendations. It's kind of we needed to get clear direction on what you want to accomplish and guidance on how those, how we might go about accomplishing those things so that we could move on to the implementation plan and be more specific about program initiatives and timing and costs and funding, etc.
So I guess
I don't think I'm answering your question, or I'm answering it badly. I'm sorry.
You're answering it well, but not entirely.
Okay.
Well, this is just a question. If there's something else we think should be in this, either as a program, an implementation thing, or part of this more specific strategy as opposed to indicators or objectives or goals or vision, when's the time
Please send it
suggest
to us, because we're working on it right now to have something to bring back to you. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of these things we're actually already doing, or we're doing
Right.
parts of. We're already trying to think about, you know, what recommendations we want to bring up as part of your budget process. But if there's something that you really see something missing out of this, please send us an email, because we may have it categorized in something, or we may have missed it.
Okay.
I guess to ask Councilmember Kovar's question in maybe a slightly different way is, given that in the next couple of weeks we're going to be going into our priority retreat meetings, it would be helpful as you're taking in the conversation from this evening and thinking about things, if there's anything as we're looking at those priorities again this year and thinking about moving forward into the budget, if there are things that we don't already have highlighted in that document, but you're like, you know what, we're going to come back to you in like February and say we really want to do this, it would be helpful just to kind of, I think, get a heads up
Yes.
in that. And even if we just kind of put a placeholder
Even if we have
for it.
yeah, even if we have a sheet of paper with some things, with some numbers associated with it, so you have a concept of the magnitude. And
I think that would be helpful as we're going into our priority retreats. And then in the same respect, if there's something, again, as we're reviewing this over the next couple of weeks, talking to residents, getting their feedback, you know, bringing that back and saying, oh, what about this? Okay. So, yeah.
The last thing I just want to mention on this is that when I first brought this, when we first started getting into this in October, I mentioned that this stuff's really hard when it gets down to the reality. And so as Sarah mentioned, that some of these need to be inspirational. And so part of this sometimes is a particular item looks scary, but the bigger picture is, if we don't do something bold, we will not have housing that's affordable for the residents in Tacoma Park. And so it does take a big step. It does take a commitment. And we're trying to get it right by coming back to you and making sure we have the language right and we're looking at the right things. But at some point, we're going to have to take a bit of a leap into saying, yes, we need to do these steps, and it's going to cost, and it's going to change some neighborhoods, and that's hard, but it's the right thing to do. And so making sure we have it, so we've thought it through and it's the right thing to do, is the important part of coming back through you and as you talk with your residents. But I would hate to have gone through this whole process, this multi-year process, and end up with something wimpy. You know, it's got to be something that says, yes, we're going to have housing affordability in Tacoma Park. So
Too bad
there's
Nicola
that.
wasn't here from the Sentinel, because that would have been the lead. Good. I think that's a perfect way to end this discussion, quite frankly. I think that is a good way to end. We promise to come back to Ms. Daines with more feedback on indicators and the recommendations if anything's missing, and we look forward to continuing this. Thank you for all the work on this. I appreciate it. All right, we are adjourned. See you Monday night for Martin Luther King Day, and hopefully Monday morning, and then definitely back here 6 p.m. on Wednesday. Thank you all.